Daniel Brooks never expected to find a stranger in his bathroom at 2 a.m., dripping wet and trembling with terror. The single father had spent years building walls around his quiet life, working night shifts, protecting his daughter, surviving on the edge of exhaustion. But when the homeless woman he'd once helped outside a convenience store appeared in his home like a ghost, everything changed. She wasn't just running from the rain, she was running from men who wanted her dead. And by letting her stay, Daniel had just painted a target on his own back and his daughter's. Before we begin this story of desperate choices and dangerous compassion, please hit the like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story reaches. Now, let's dive into Daniel's world. The rain hammered against the windshield like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry, each drop merging with the next until the world outside became nothing but streaming gray chaos. Daniel Brooks sat motionless in his aging Honda Civic, hands still gripping the steering wheel though he'd turned off the engine 3 minutes ago. The dashboard clock glowed 1:47 a.m. in cold blue numbers, marking the end of another 16-hour day that had stolen his strength and left him hollow. Through the rain-blurred window, his house looked smaller than it had any right to be. A weathered single-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch roof that he kept meaning to fix but never found the time or money for. The neighborhood slept around him, a collection of tired homes inhabited by tired people, all of them grinding through their own private struggles in the working-class outskirts of Portland, where ambition came to rest and dreams learned to be quieter. Daniel's entire body ached with the specific exhaustion that came from carrying boxes and loading trucks and driving endless routes through the dark while more fortunate people slept. At 32, he felt decades older, worn down by the relentless machinery of single parenthood and minimum wage survival. His shoulders protested as he finally released the steering wheel, his lower back sending sharp reminders that he'd lifted too many heavy packages without proper form, rushing to meet impossible delivery quotas that treated human bodies like expendable machines. The porch light was on. He'd left it burning for himself, knowing he'd return in the dead hours when the world felt most abandoned. Emma would be asleep inside, tucked safely in her bed with the unicorn sheets she'd picked out at the thrift store last month, thrilled by the small luxury. His daughter, 7 years old and the only thing in his life that made sense, the only reason he dragged himself through these punishing shifts and came home to this house that leaked when it rained hard and never quite got warm enough in winter. Daniel grabbed his thermos from the cup holder, empty now, every drop of coffee long since consumed in his war against sleep, and pushed open the car door. The rain hit him immediately, cold and aggressive, soaking through his jacket in seconds. He'd learned to move quickly through Portland's endless rain, but tonight his body refused to cooperate, muscles sluggish with fatigue as he trudged toward the house. His keys jangled in the lock, the sound seeming too loud in the sleeping neighborhood, and then he was inside, dripping on the worn linoleum of the entryway. The house smelled like the pasta dinner he'd left in the slow cooker before his shift. Emma had probably eaten it with Diane from next door, the elderly widow who watched his daughter for almost nothing because she was lonely and kind and one of the few people in this world Daniel trusted completely. He locked the door behind him with practiced precision, engaging the deadbolt and the chain, then kicked off his soaked work boots and peeled away his wet jacket. The house was quiet with that particular stillness of early morning when even the usual creaks and settles of old wood seemed to hold their breath. Through Emma's partially open bedroom door, he could see the soft glow of her nightlight, shaped like a crescent moon, casting gentle shadows across her walls. Daniel moved quietly down the short hallway, his sock feet silent on the threadbare carpet. He paused at Emma's door, pushing it open just enough to see her small form curled beneath her blankets, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one hand clutching the stuffed elephant he'd won for her at a street fair 2 summers ago. His chest tightened with the fierce, protective love that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. This tiny person who depended on him completely, who trusted him to keep her safe and fed and happy in a world that seemed designed to grind people like them into dust. She was everything. The reason he worked until his body screamed. The reason he'd given up on his own dreams and learned to be satisfied with survival. The reason he couldn't afford to take risks or make mistakes or let his guard down even for a moment. Daniel pulled her door mostly closed again and turned toward the bathroom, already anticipating the relief of hot water on his aching muscles. The brief sanctuary of a shower before he collapsed into his own bed for whatever few hours of sleep he could steal before Emma woke up needing breakfast and conversation and the kind of patient attention he'd have to manufacture from his depleted reserves. The bathroom door was closed. He didn't remember closing it, he usually left it open during the day, but exhaustion made memory unreliable, and maybe Emma had closed it, or maybe he had that morning and simply forgotten in the blur of his endless routine. His hand found the knob, turned it, and he stepped inside, reaching automatically for the light switch. The overhead bulb flickered to life with its usual slight delay, filling the small bathroom with harsh white light, and Daniel's entire world stopped. A woman stood pressed against the wall beside his shower, dripping wet, shaking violently, her eyes enormous with what looked like pure terror. She was thin, too thin, wearing clothes that might have once been professional but now hung on her frame in sodden, filthy tatters. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, water still streaming down her face, and her hands were raised in front of her in a gesture that was part surrender, part defensive shield. For one frozen heartbeat, neither of them moved. Daniel's exhausted brain struggled to process what his eyes were reporting, cycling through possibilities: hallucination, intruder, nightmare, while his body locked into a paralysis born of shock and adrenaline's sudden flood. Then recognition hit him like a physical blow. He knew this woman. Or rather, he'd seen her before, weeks ago, maybe a month. The specifics blurred in his memory, but the image remained. A convenience store parking lot late at night, him stopping for coffee between delivery routes, and this woman sitting against the wall near the entrance, hollow-eyed and shivering, holding a piece of cardboard with words he couldn't quite remember. He'd bought her a sandwich and a bottle of water, handed them over with a few awkward words about staying safe, and driven away feeling that peculiar mixture of inadequacy and relief that came from small acts of charity that couldn't possibly address the enormity of someone else's suffering. And now she was in his bathroom, in his house, where his daughter slept. "Please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, her voice hoarse and breaking. "Please don't. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I needed—" Daniel found his voice, though it came out harder than he intended, sharpened by fear for Emma, by the violation of his home's safety. "How did you get in here?" She flinched at his tone, pressing harder against the wall, as if she could merge with it and disappear. "The window, the back bathroom window. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know where else. They're looking for me. They're going to find me, and I just—" Her words tumbled over each other, panic making them almost incoherent. "I remembered you, the man who helped me. And I followed you home one night. I know that's crazy. I know I sound crazy, but I just needed to remember where someone kind lived in case you broke into their house." Daniel's hands were shaking now, adrenaline fighting with exhaustion for control of his body. His mind raced through options: call the police, wake Diane, physically remove her himself. But something held him frozen. Something in her eyes that looked less like threat and more like absolute desperation. "Just one night," she said, and tears were mixing with the rainwater on her face now, her voice cracking completely. "Please, just one night to get warm and dry and feel safe enough to sleep. I'll leave before sunrise, I promise. You'll never see me again. A sob broke through her words. "I can't do another night out there. I can't." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat seeming to echo in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to protect Emma, to get this stranger out of his home immediately, to eliminate the unknown variable that had invaded their fragile stability. But he'd looked into eyes like hers before, not often, but enough times to recognize the particular quality of fear that came from having nowhere left to go, no one left to trust, nothing left to lose. "Who's looking for you?" The question came out before he decided to ask it, his body remaining tense and ready to move, blocking the doorway between this woman and the hallway that led to his daughter's room. She shook her head, her whole body trembling so violently now that her teeth chattered. "You wouldn't believe me. I know how I look. I know what I must seem like. Some crazy homeless woman breaking into your house. But I swear I'm not dangerous. I swear I won't hurt anyone. I just need—" "Answer the question." Daniel kept his voice low but firm, aware that Emma could wake at any moment, that this entire surreal situation could spiral into something far worse if he didn't maintain some measure of control. "Who's looking for you, and why?" The woman's eyes darted toward the window she'd apparently climbed through, then back to Daniel's face, calculating something, weighing risks in a mind that looked pushed far past its limits. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming quieter but somehow more grounded, as if reaching for some last reserve of coherence. "My name is Ivy Lane. 6 months ago, I had a job, an apartment, a normal life. I was an executive assistant at Meridian Capital Management downtown, and I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." She paused, and Daniel saw her jaw clench, saw her force herself to continue. Numbers that didn't add up. Money moving in ways that made no sense. And when I started asking questions, when I went to my boss to report what I thought were accounting errors, her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He smiled at me. Actually smiled. And then everything I had disappeared. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "I mean, I was fired that afternoon. By the time I got home, I'd been evicted. They claimed I hadn't paid rent in months, showed documents I'd never seen. My bank accounts were frozen for suspicious activity. My credit cards canceled. My phone shut off." Ivy's hands had lowered slightly, no longer defensive, just shaking with cold and memory. "Within 48 hours, I had nothing. No job, no home, no way to prove who I was or what had happened. And then the threats started." "Threats," Daniel repeated, the words sitting heavy in the small bathroom. "Men in cars watching the places I tried to stay. Messages left with the few friends I had. Warnings about what happens to people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut. One night, someone grabbed me in an alley and told me very clearly that if I went to the police, if I talked to anyone about what I'd seen, I wouldn't live to regret it." She pulled up the sleeves of her ruined jacket, and even in the harsh bathroom light, Daniel could see the bruises ringing her wrists, dark purple and yellow-green, the distinct marks of someone's grip. "I've been running ever since. Shelters, then streets, then under bridges, when even the shelters felt too visible. And tonight," her voice broke again. "Tonight I saw them again, 3 blocks from here, and I remembered your face, the only kindness anyone's shown me in months, and I couldn't do another night hoping I'd wake up in the morning." The silence that followed felt dense enough to drown in. Daniel stood motionless, his tired mind trying to process this woman's story, trying to separate truth from delusion, real danger from paranoid fantasy. She could be mentally ill. She could be lying. She could be exactly what she appeared to be, a desperate person with nowhere else to turn. But she could also be something else entirely, some threat he couldn't identify. And his daughter was sleeping 20 feet away. But those bruises were real. The terror in her eyes was real. And something in her story had the weight of truth, the kind of messy, complicated truth that didn't fit into neat categories of victim or threat. "Please," Ivy said again, and the word came out as something close to a prayer. "I know what I'm asking. I know how insane this is, but I have nothing left, no one left, and I'm so tired of being afraid." Daniel's jaw tightened. He thought about Emma, about the responsibility that defined every moment of his life, about how he'd promised himself he would never take unnecessary risks when it came to his daughter's safety. He thought about calling the police, about what they would find, a homeless woman who broke into his house with a story about corporate conspiracies and men in cars, a story they'd hear as mental illness or manipulation. He thought about turning her out into the rain, about how he'd lie awake wondering if she'd survived the night, if those men she claimed were hunting her had found their mark. And he thought about the sandwich he'd handed her in that parking lot, about the moment of connection between two exhausted people existing on the margins of a city that moved too fast to notice their struggles, about how one small act of kindness had somehow brought her back to his doorstep when she had nowhere else to go. "The bathroom window," he said quietly. "Show me." Ivy blinked, confusion crossing her face, but she moved slowly toward the small window above the toilet, gesturing to where the old latch had clearly been forced. "I'm sorry, I'll pay for it, I promise, when I can—" "That window's been broken for 3 months, Daniel said, cutting her off. "I keep meaning to fix it. It doesn't latch properly." He saw relief flicker across her features, though wariness remained. If you're lying to me, if there's any part of this that puts my daughter in danger, I will not hesitate to call the police and press charges for breaking and entering. Do you understand? Yes. The word came out quick and fervent. Yes, I understand. I swear I would never. Children should be safe. I would never. You can stay tonight, Daniel said, and heard how the words hung in the air, irrevocable now that he had spoken them. But we're going to talk. All of it. Everything that happened to you. Everything you think you saw. Everything you're running from. And then I'm going to decide what comes next. He paused, letting the weight of his next words register fully. If your story changes, if I think you're not being honest, you leave. Immediately. Clear? Clear. Ivy's eyes were wet again, but these tears looked different, relief rather than terror. Thank you. God, thank you. Don't, Daniel said sharply, then softened his tone with visible effort. Don't thank me yet. We haven't gotten through tonight. He gestured for her to follow him, acutely aware of Emma's room as they passed it, of how he positioned his body between Ivy and that door instinctively. In the kitchen, he pulled out one of the mismatched chairs at his small table and pointed to it. Sit. I'm going to get you some dry clothes and a towel. You're going to change, get warm, and then you're going to tell me everything. Ivy sank into the chair as if her legs had suddenly given out, her wet clothes creating a puddle on the linoleum. She looked even smaller sitting down, even more fragile. And Daniel had to remind himself that fragility didn't equal harmlessness, that he was taking a calculated risk in a life that couldn't afford many risks. In his bedroom, he pulled out an old sweatshirt and a pair of sweatpants, both too large for Ivy's frame but warm and dry, a towel from the bathroom closet. When he returned to the kitchen, she was sitting exactly where he'd left her, staring at her hands in her lap as if she couldn't quite believe they were still attached to her body. Bathroom's free, he said, handing her the clothes and towel. Get changed. I'll make coffee. She took the bundle from him with trembling hands, met his eyes for just a moment, and in that moment, Daniel saw not the desperate stranger who'd invaded his home, but something else entirely. A person who'd been someone before all this, someone with a job title and an apartment and probably friends and routines and all the small dignities that separated people from survival. While the coffee maker gurgled and hissed, Daniel stood at the kitchen sink and stared out the window at the rain-soaked darkness. His reflection looked back at him. Haggard, uncertain, older than 32 had any right to look. What was he doing? What had he just agreed to? The exhaustion that had felt so overwhelming when he first arrived home seemed distant now, pushed aside by adrenaline and the strange clarity that sometimes came with impossible situations. The bathroom door opened and Ivy emerged wearing his clothes, the sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, the sweatpants rolled several times at the waist. She'd towel-dried her hair into a dark, messy halo around her face, and without the rain and terror distorting her features, Daniel could see that she was probably close to his age, maybe a year or two younger. Her face was hollow with exhaustion and hunger, bruises he hadn't noticed before marking her cheekbone and jaw, but her eyes had cleared slightly, focusing with an intensity that suggested she was fighting hard to hold herself together. Sit, Daniel said again, and this time it came out gentler. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black because he had no milk, and only a few packets of sugar stolen from convenience stores. When did you last eat? Ivy wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if it were a lifeline, breathing in the steam before taking a careful sip. Yesterday morning, someone left half a breakfast sandwich on a bench. She said it without shame, just stating a fact, and Daniel felt something twist in his chest. He opened his refrigerator, sparse and depressing, the landscape of single-parent poverty, and pulled out the container of leftover pasta. Without asking, he spooned a portion into a bowl and heated it in the microwave, the domestic normality of the action, feeling surreal against the strangeness of the night. When the microwave beeped, he set the bowl in front of her with a fork. Eat first, then talk. Ivy looked at the food for a long moment, and Daniel saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Then she picked up the fork and began to eat, slowly at first, as if her body had forgotten how to process food. Then with increasing urgency, hunger overriding caution. She ate without speaking, without looking up, and Daniel gave her that privacy. nursing his own coffee, and trying to organize his thoughts into questions that might reveal whether he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. When the bowl was empty, Ivy set down the fork with a shaking hand and finally met his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the food. For not calling the cops immediately. For—" She gestured helplessly at the kitchen, at herself, at the impossible situation. "For this." "Tell me about Meridian Capital Management," Daniel said, bypassing pleasantries. "From the beginning. What exactly did you see?" Ivy took another long sip of coffee, and Daniel watched her gather herself, saw the effort it took to organize trauma and fear into coherent narrative. When she began speaking, her voice was steadier than it had been in the bathroom, as if the food and warmth had restored some essential part of her that panic had stolen. "I was hired 14 months ago as an executive assistant to Thomas Carver, the VP of Investment Operations. It was a good job, really good. $65,000 a year, full benefits, corner office views. I was so proud of myself." A bitter smile crossed her face. "I thought I'd finally made it, out of retail hell and into something that mattered." Daniel nodded, saying nothing, letting her continue. The work was normal at first, managing schedules, organizing files, preparing presentations. Thomas was demanding, but not cruel. The office was typical corporate culture. Ambitious people climbing ladders, office politics, too much coffee and not enough sleep. I was good at my job. Really good. She paused, staring into her coffee. Maybe too good. What does that mean? It means I paid attention. It means when something looked wrong, I noticed. Ivy's hands tightened around the mug. About 4 months ago, I was preparing a quarterly report. Just routine stuff, numbers I'd compiled dozens of times before. But something was off. Money flowing into accounts that shouldn't have existed, wire transfers with vague descriptions, millions of dollars moving through the company in patterns that made no sense. Daniel felt his pulse quicken despite himself. "And you went to your boss?" "Not immediately. First, I double-checked everything. Spent 2 weeks going through old files, comparing numbers, making sure I wasn't seeing patterns that weren't there. But the more I looked, the worse it got. Phantom investments, fabricated returns, client funds being diverted into accounts I couldn't trace." She met his eyes directly now, and Daniel saw conviction there, the kind that came from absolute certainty. They were stealing millions and millions of dollars from their own clients, running a scheme so sophisticated that it should have been invisible, and it would have been if I hadn't been the kind of person who double-checks everything. "So you reported it?" "I asked Thomas about it first, casually, like maybe I'd made a mistake in the filing system, like maybe there was some aspect of high-level finance I didn't understand. And that's when—" Ivy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's when his whole demeanor changed. He looked at the documents I'd printed. I can still see his face, the way his expression went completely blank for just a second before he smiled at me. This cold, calculated smile. And he said, 'Ivy, you're too smart for your own good.'" The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the darkness outside the window more oppressive. Daniel found himself leaning forward, caught despite himself in the story this stranger was telling. "He told me to forget what I'd seen, told me there were explanations I wouldn't understand, that I should trust the people above me knew what they were doing. But his voice—" Ivy shuddered. "His voice made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning, and then he took the documents, every single page I'd printed, and shredded them while I watched. Told me to go home early, take the rest of the day off, come back Monday with a fresh perspective." "And when you came back?" "I didn't have a chance. I was called into HR first thing Monday morning, terminated for cause. Supposedly I'd been stealing office supplies, using the company credit card for personal expenses, falsifying my timesheets. They had evidence, they said. Documents and receipts and witness statements, all of it fabricated, but it looked so real." Her voice rose slightly with remembered frustration. "They escorted me out of the building like a criminal, wouldn't let me collect my personal belongings. Security literally walked me to the street and watched until I was out of sight." "Jesus," Daniel breathed. "That was just the beginning. I went home planning to fight it, to contact a lawyer, to go to the SEC, to expose everything I'd found. But when I got to my apartment building, the locks were changed. The building manager handed me an eviction notice, claimed I hadn't paid rent in 3 months. 3 months! I showed him my bank statements, proof of every payment, but he had different records. Records that showed me as delinquent, records that had my signature but that I'd never seen before. Ivy's hands were shaking again now, coffee sloshing slightly in the mug. My bank accounts were frozen that afternoon. Suspicious activity, they said. Under investigation. My credit cards were canceled. My phone service terminated for non-payment. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. In one day? In less than 6 hours. That's how I knew Thomas hadn't just fired me to cover his ass. He'd planned this. Or someone above him had. They'd been waiting to see if I'd be smart enough to find their scheme, and when I was, they activated some kind of protocol to erase me. She laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You can't fight people who can rewrite reality itself, who can make you disappear from every system, every record, every database. I became no one, a ghost. The rain continued its assault on the windows, each drop a tiny impact that seemed to echo the larger violence of Ivy's story. Daniel tried to imagine it, waking up one morning with a life and going to bed that night with nothing. It seemed impossible, something from a paranoid thriller rather than real life. But the woman sitting across from him was real. The bruises on her wrists were real. And the look in her eyes suggested she'd lived through something that had fundamentally rewired her understanding of how the world worked. You said men started following you, Daniel prompted when the silence stretched too long. Ivy nodded, setting down her coffee mug as if she needed both hands free to tell this part. At first I thought I was paranoid. Being homeless, sleeping on the streets, it does things to your mind. It makes you see threats everywhere. But then one night, maybe 2 weeks after I'd lost everything, I was trying to sleep under an overpass and a car pulled up. 2 men got out. They didn't try to hide who they were or why they were there. They walked right up to me, and one of them... She stopped, swallowing hard. One of them crouched down until his face was inches from mine and told me very clearly what would happen if I talked. To anyone. About anything. He was specific about it. Creative. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did you go to the police? And tell them what? That the company I'd been fired from for stealing was actually running a massive fraud? That mysterious men were threatening me, but I had no evidence, no witnesses, no proof of anything? I was homeless, desperate, probably looking half crazy. Who would believe me? She met his eyes with an expression that was half challenge, half desperation. You barely believe me now, and you're the one who let me in. He couldn't argue with that. Even now, sitting across from her, seeing the physical evidence of violence on her body, part of him wondered if she was delusional, if her story was the elaborate construction of a mind broken by trauma and homelessness. But another part, the part that had worked enough minimum wage jobs to know how easily powerful people crushed vulnerable ones, that had seen enough of the world's casual cruelty to know that conspiracies didn't have to be elaborate to be effective. That part recognized the ring of truth in her words. So you've been running, Daniel said, for 6 months, trying to stay invisible, moving between shelters when I could get a bed, sleeping outside when I couldn't, keeping my head down and hoping they'd eventually decide I wasn't worth watching anymore. Ivy's voice had gone flat now, exhausted by the retelling. But tonight, I saw them again. Same car, same men, circling the area where I'd been sleeping, and I broke. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't spend another night wondering if I'd wake up or if they'd finally decided it was easier to make me disappear permanently. And you remembered me, Daniel said quietly. I remembered the man who bought me a sandwich, who looked at me like I was still a person instead of garbage on the street, who said stay safe like he actually meant it. Tears were sliding down her face again, but her voice remained steady. I know it was crazy to follow you home that night. I know how that sounds, but I just needed to remember where kindness lived, in case I ever got desperate enough to, she gestured around the kitchen, at the impossible situation they were in, to do something this insane. Daniel stood abruptly, needing movement, needing to think. He walked to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked street, at the neighborhood sleeping through crisis and revelation alike. What Ivy was describing, corporate fraud on a massive scale, systematic erasure of a witness, ongoing threats and violence, if even half of it was true, she needed more help than he could provide. She needed lawyers, federal investigators, witness protection. But she also needed something more immediate. She needed someone to believe her, someone to choose her safety over their own comfort, someone willing to take a risk. And maybe, just maybe, she needed whatever evidence she still had to be taken seriously. Daniel turned back to face her. You said you saw numbers, documents, evidence of the fraud. Did you keep any of it? Make copies? Ivy's expression shifted, something almost like hope flickering across her features. I took photos. Before I confronted Thomas. I knew it might blow up, so I documented everything I could with my phone. Account numbers, transfer receipts, investor statements, dozens of photos showing the whole scheme. And where's the phone now? Gone. Stolen or lost in the first week on the streets? I don't even remember, but she paused, and Daniel saw her calculating something, weighing risks. But I backed everything up. Cloud storage. I set up an account just for this, something separate from my work or personal accounts, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Can you access it? If I had a computer, if I could remember the password, it's been so long, and my mind is... She pressed her hands against her temples. I used to be so sharp, so organized. Now I can't even remember what day it is half the time. Daniel thought about his ancient laptop, the one he used for Emma's online homework and his own rare internet browsing. Thought about the Pandora's box they might be opening if they accessed those files, if the evidence Ivy claimed to have was real and damning. Thought about how his life could change, would change, if he committed to helping her instead of sending her back out into the rain. And he thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in her room, trusting him to keep her safe, to make good choices, to be the father she deserved. Tomorrow, Daniel said finally, after Emma goes to school, you can try to access your files, and I'll look at what you have. If it's real, if you actually have evidence of what you're describing, then we figure out the next step together. But if it's not there, if you can't prove any of this, then we need to talk about getting you different kinds of help. He held up a hand as she started to protest. Mental health services, social services, whatever you need. I'm not throwing you out, but I can't let you stay here indefinitely based on a story, no matter how compelling. Ivy nodded slowly, fresh tears spilling over. That's fair. That's more than fair. I know how crazy I sound. You don't sound crazy, Daniel interrupted. You sound terrified. There's a difference. He rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion creeping back now that the adrenaline was fading. You can sleep on the couch tonight. I'll get you a blanket and pillow. But in the morning, when Emma wakes up, you need to be invisible. I'll figure out what to tell her, but I won't have her scared in her own home. Understood? Understood, I promise. I'll... Stop promising, Daniel said, not unkindly. Just do it. That's all I need from you right now. Follow through. He found spare bedding in the hallway closet, a blanket that had seen better days, and one of the pillows from his own bed, and made up the couch while Ivy watched from the kitchen doorway. The domestic task felt surreal, like he was hosting an unexpected guest rather than harboring someone who might be either a victim or a delusion made flesh. When the couch was ready, Daniel paused, studying this woman who'd upended his carefully controlled life in the span of 20 minutes. Tomorrow we'll figure this out. But tonight, you need to sleep. Real sleep. You're safe here. Safe, Ivy repeated, as if testing the word in her mouth. I'd almost forgotten what that feels like. Daniel headed toward his bedroom, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but paused in the hallway. Ivy? The men you say are looking for you. Do they know about me? About helping you at the convenience store? She shook her head. I don't think so. They were watching shelters, places where homeless people gather. I don't think they saw me follow you home that night. I was careful. Good, Daniel said, though the word felt inadequate. Keep being careful. Both our lives might depend on it. In his bedroom, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall, his mind refusing to quiet despite his body's desperate need for sleep. He just allowed a stranger into his home, someone with a story that was either genuine victimization or elaborate delusion. He'd promised to help her access potential evidence of corporate fraud that, if real, could put them both in danger. And he'd done it all while his daughter slept 20 feet away, blissfully unaware that their quiet life had just become infinitely more complicated. But as he finally lay down and closed his eyes, Daniel realized he didn't regret it. Not yet, anyway. Because if Ivy was telling the truth, if she really was running from people who'd stolen her entire life, then maybe one person's moment of compassion could be the difference between survival and surrender. And if she was lying or confused or broken in ways he couldn't fix, well, he'd deal with that when morning came and Emma's laughter filled the house and the rain finally stopped and the world looked less like a noir film and more like the ordinary struggle he'd learned to navigate. The rain continued to fall, washing the night clean of everything except the strange new weight of responsibility Daniel had chosen to carry. And in the living room, a woman who'd had nowhere left to go finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found somewhere to stop running, even if only for one night. Morning arrived with the kind of gray, reluctant light that Portland specialized in, as if the sun itself was too exhausted to fully commit to rising. Daniel woke to the sound of Emma's bedroom door opening, that familiar creak that meant his daughter was awake and would soon come padding down the hallway seeking breakfast and conversation. His eyes snapped open, exhaustion still weighing heavily on his body, but consciousness arriving with sudden, crystal clarity as he remembered everything that had happened in the dark hours before dawn. Ivy, on his couch, in his living room. He was out of bed and moving before his mind fully caught up with his body, pulling on yesterday's jeans and a clean shirt, his sock feet silent on the carpet as he emerged into the hallway just as Emma's door opened wider. His daughter stood there in her pajamas, the ones with cartoon cats that were getting too small for her but that she refused to give up. Her dark hair a wild tangle around her sleepy face, her eyes still heavy with the remnants of dreams. "Morning, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice coming out more tense than he intended. He forced himself to soften it, to sound normal, to be the father she expected to find every morning. "How'd you sleep?" "Good," Emma said, rubbing her eyes with the back of one small hand. "I'm hungry. Can we have pancakes?" "How about cereal this morning?" Daniel was already moving past her, positioning himself between Emma and the living room, his mind racing through explanations and contingencies. "I've got an early errand to run, so we need to keep breakfast quick." Emma's face fell slightly. Pancakes were their weekend tradition, the one small luxury they allowed themselves. But she nodded with the resigned acceptance of a child who'd learned early that disappointment was just part of life. "Okay. Can I watch cartoons?" "Not this morning, baby. I need you to stay in your room for a bit while I handle some grown-up stuff, okay? You can play with your dolls or read your books." Daniel crouched down to her eye level, keeping his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "I'll bring you breakfast in your room, and then we'll get you ready for school. Sound good?" Suspicion flickered across Emma's features. She was too smart, too perceptive, already learning to read the subtle stress signals that adults tried to hide. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Daniel lied and hated himself a little for how easily the words came. "Just some boring stuff I need to take care of." "Adult things are boring, remember?" "Boring," Emma repeated, her tone suggesting she didn't entirely believe him but was willing to accept the explanation because she trusted him. That trust felt like a weight settling on Daniel's shoulders, heavy and precious and terrifying. He got her settled back in her room with a bowl of cereal and her favorite stuffed elephant, closed the door with a promise that he'd be back soon to help her get dressed, and then turned toward the living room with something close to dread tightening his chest. Ivy was already awake, sitting upright on the couch with the blanket pulled around her shoulders like a shield. She looked worse in the morning light, the bruises on her face more pronounced, the hollows of her cheeks deeper, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. But she also looked alert, tense, like an animal that had learned to wake ready to run. "I heard her," Ivy said quietly, her voice rough with sleep. "Your daughter." "I'll stay out of sight, I promise." Daniel nodded, moving into the kitchen and gesturing for Ivy to follow. He kept his voice low, aware of how sound carried in the small house. "I'm taking Emma to school in an hour. While she's getting ready, you stay in here. Don't come out, don't make noise. When we leave, you can move around, but if any neighbors come by..." "I'll hide," Ivy finished. "I know how to be invisible. I've had practice." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of 6 months spent learning to disappear. Daniel poured coffee into 2 mugs, his movements automatic, buying himself time to think through the logistics of the day ahead. He had a shift starting at 3 in the afternoon, a shorter one, only 8 hours instead of his usual double, but that meant he'd be gone until 11 tonight, leaving Ivy alone in his house with access to everything he owned, everything Emma needed. "I need to call in sick," Daniel said, the decision forming even as he spoke the words. "I can't go to work today. Not with—" He gestured vaguely at the situation, at Ivy herself, at the impossible complexity that had invaded his life. "Not with all this." "No," Ivy said immediately, setting down her coffee with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. "No, you can't do that. You can't risk your job because of me. I'll be fine here alone. I'll stay out of sight. I won't—" "You'll access your cloud storage," Daniel interrupted. "That's what you'll do. My laptop is ancient and slow, but it works. While I'm at work, you're going to try to find that evidence you mentioned. The photos, the documents, whatever you backed up. And when I get home tonight, we're going to look at it together and figure out what the hell to do next." Ivy stared at him for a long moment, something complicated passing across her face. Gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with a desperate kind of hope that looked like it physically hurt. "You're trusting me. With your home, your computer, your daughter's space. You don't even know if I'm telling the truth." "I don't," Daniel agreed. "But I'm choosing to believe you anyway. Maybe that makes me stupid, but—" He stopped, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "I spent 6 months working doubles and coming home to an empty house while Emma slept and telling myself that this was enough, that survival was enough, that I didn't have the luxury of caring about anyone beyond my daughter and myself. And then you showed up in my bathroom looking like fear incarnate, and I realized I'd been lying to myself. I still have choices. I can still decide what kind of person I want to be. Even if it's dangerous." "Everything's dangerous," Daniel said, and heard the exhaustion in his own voice. "Working myself to death is dangerous. Raising a kid alone in this neighborhood is dangerous. Being poor is dangerous every single day in 100 small ways people with money never have to think about. At least this way, I'm choosing my risk instead of having it chosen for me." Ivy's eyes were wet again, but she blinked the tears back with visible effort. "I'll find the evidence. I promise. And then we'll take it to someone who can actually do something with it. The FBI, the SEC, someone. And you'll be done with all this. I'll be gone, and you can go back to your normal life." Daniel didn't mention that he was increasingly certain there would be no going back, that the moment he'd decided to help her, he'd crossed some invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, he just nodded and finished his coffee, already mentally preparing for the conversation he'd need to have with Emma about why they couldn't take their usual route to school, why he'd be watching the rear-view mirror more carefully than normal, why he'd be asking her teacher to call him immediately if anyone unfamiliar tried to pick her up. The morning routine proceeded with surreal normalcy, Emma getting dressed, brushing her teeth, chattering about the math test she was nervous about, and the girl in her class who'd brought cookies to share yesterday. Daniel responded with appropriate sounds and encouragements while his mind ran through contingencies, worst-case scenarios, exit strategies. He packed Emma's lunch with extra care, as if perfect sandwich construction could somehow protect her from the chaos gathering at the edges of their lives. Ivy remained hidden in the kitchen, silent as a ghost, and Daniel was grateful for her discretion even as he hated the necessity of it. When it was finally time to leave, he bundled Emma into her jacket and backpack, locked the door behind them with the new awareness of how inadequate that lock was, and loaded his daughter into the car with a watchfulness that made his shoulders ache with tension. "Daddy, you're being weird," Emma observed as Daniel checked his mirrors for the 3rd time before even starting the engine. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, baby. Just tired. Didn't sleep well." Not entirely a lie. He'd maybe gotten 3 hours of broken, anxious sleep after Ivy's story had finally wound down. "Tell me about your math test. What kind of problems are on it?" Emma launched into an explanation of long division that Daniel only half heard, his attention divided between his daughter's voice and the street around them, searching for unfamiliar cars, suspicious patterns, threats he couldn't name. The drive to Emma's elementary school took 12 minutes through morning traffic, and Daniel spent every one of them hyper-vigilant, his exhausted brain manufacturing danger from every vehicle that followed them for more than 2 blocks. But they arrived without incident, and Daniel walked Emma to the entrance like he did every morning, crouching down to kiss her forehead and remind her to be good and tell her he loved her. Emma hugged him back with the unself-conscious affection of 7 years old, and Daniel held on a moment longer than usual, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo and letting himself feel the fierce protective love that defined every choice he made. "Love you too, Daddy," Emma said, pulling back to look at his face with those two perceptive eyes. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm sure," Daniel lied again, and watched her join the stream of children flowing into the building, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. He stood there until she disappeared from view, then walked back to his car with the weight of responsibility pressing down like a physical force. The drive home took longer. He circled the block 3 times, checking for vehicles that might be watching his house, for men who fit the vague description Ivy had provided. But the neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. Tired houses inhabited by tired people, a few early rising workers heading to jobs, the usual landscape of working-class survival. Ivy was sitting at the kitchen table when Daniel came through the door, his ancient laptop open in front of her, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if she'd been frozen mid-motion. She looked up as he entered, and Daniel saw naked fear on her face. "I can't remember the password," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I've been sitting here trying every combination I can think of, and nothing works. 6 months of living on the streets, and I can't even remember something this basic, and—" She pressed her palms against her eyes. "What if it's gone? What if I can't access it, and there's no evidence, and you've risked everything for nothing?" Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, fighting his own surge of frustration. "Walk me through it. When you created the account, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind?" "I was terrified," Ivy said immediately. "I knew I was about to confront Thomas, and I knew it could go badly. I wanted something secure, something they wouldn't find even if they searched my main accounts." She stared at the laptop screen as if willing it to reveal its secrets. "I used a password generator, something random and complex. I wrote it down on a piece of paper that I kept in my wallet, but the wallet was stolen or lost. I don't even know." "Okay," Daniel said, forcing his voice to remain calm, analytical. "But you must have had to type it a few times, right? To set up the account, to access it initially. Maybe your fingers remember even if your conscious mind doesn't. Just try. Don't think about it. Just let your hands move." Ivy looked skeptical but positioned her fingers over the keyboard, closing her eyes. Daniel watched as she began typing, her hands moving in short bursts and stops, deleting and retyping, her face a mask of concentration. 10 minutes passed. 20. Daniel should have been getting ready for work, should have been calling to say he'd be late, but he sat frozen, watching this woman fight to reclaim evidence of her own erased life. And then Ivy's entire body went rigid, her eyes snapping open. "I'm in," she whispered. "Oh my God, I'm in." Daniel moved to stand behind her, looking at the laptop screen. A cloud storage interface filled the display, and Ivy was clicking through folders with shaking hands, her breath coming fast and shallow. And then she opened a folder labeled simply MC, and the screen filled with thumbnails of photographs. "This is it," Ivy breathed. "This is everything." Daniel leaned closer, and what he saw made his stomach clench. Photo after photo of financial documents, account statements, wire transfer receipts, numbers that even his non-financial brain could recognize as suspicious, transfers for round numbers like $5 million, $10 million, moving between accounts with clinical descriptions like portfolio rebalancing and investment allocation. Investor statements showing returns that didn't match the actual account values. Emails discussing discretionary fund management in language that sounded sterile but read like organized theft. "Jesus," Daniel said softly. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate?" Ivy's voice was stronger now, steadier, as if accessing the evidence had restored some essential part of her that despair had stolen. "Based on what I could track, at least $200 million, probably more. They were running it for years, setting up fake investment portfolios, showing clients fabricated returns while siphoning the actual funds into offshore accounts. The clients never knew because the statements looked perfect. The quarterly report showed growth. Everything seemed legitimate until you actually looked at where the money was going." Daniel pulled out his phone and checked the time. He had 45 minutes before he needed to leave for his shift. Not nearly enough time to process what he was seeing, to understand the full implications, to figure out their next move. We need to copy these files, all of them, multiple backups in multiple locations. Already on it, Ivy said, and Daniel saw that she was downloading the entire folder to his laptop's desktop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing complex digital systems. But Daniel, these files aren't enough on their own. They prove there was fraud, but they don't prove who was running it or how high it went. Thomas was involved, obviously, but he wasn't acting alone. This kind of scheme requires coordination from the top. The CEO, the CFO, probably the entire executive team. So what do we need? Ivy stopped typing and looked up at him, and Daniel saw calculation in her eyes, the wheels turning behind her exhaustion. We need the source documents, the actual contracts with the fake investment firms, the wire transfer authorizations with executive signatures, the internal communications discussing the scheme. I photographed what I could find, but the truly damning evidence was in Thomas's private files, documents he kept locked in his office safe. I never had access to those. Then how? We'd need to get back into Meridian Capital, Ivy said, and her voice had taken on a quality Daniel had never heard from her before. Not fear or desperation, but something harder, more determined. We'd need to physically access Thomas's office and copy those files. And before you say it's impossible, before you say it's too dangerous, I know the building's security systems. I know the schedules. I know when the cleaning crews come through and which cameras have blind spots and how to bypass the keycard readers if you know the maintenance codes. Daniel stared at her. You're talking about breaking into a major downtown office building. I'm talking about getting evidence that will actually hold up in court. Photos from my phone might get an investigation started, but they can claim I doctored them, fabricated them, that I'm a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. But original documents from their own files with executive signatures and official letterhead, that's ironclad. Ivy's hands had stopped shaking now, her entire demeanor shifting from desperate victim to something else entirely. Someone who'd spent 6 months planning revenge and was finally seeing a path forward. I've thought about this every single night while I was sleeping under bridges. How I'd do it, what I'd need, who I'd need to help me. And I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I'd need someone they wouldn't be watching, someone they had no reason to connect to me. Someone like me, Daniel said, and felt his stomach drop even as part of him understood the logic. Someone like you, Ivy confirmed, a stranger with no connection to Meridian Capital, no reason to be on their radar, no paper trail linking us together. Someone who could get into the building after hours, access the right office, copy the files, and get out before anyone knew what happened. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. I know what I'm asking. I know it's insane and dangerous and probably illegal. And I know you have a daughter to protect, a life to preserve. So if you say no, if you tell me to take these photos and go to the FBI alone, I'll understand. I'll leave right now, and you'll never have to think about this again. Daniel turned away from the laptop, walked to the kitchen window, and stared out at the rain that had started falling again. That endless Portland rain that washed the city clean but never quite erased the grime underneath. He thought about Emma, about the life he'd built for her through sheer stubborn determination. Not much of a life maybe, but safe and stable and free from the kind of danger that Ivy was proposing they walk directly into. He thought about the delivery shift waiting for him. Another 8 hours of carrying boxes and loading trucks and destroying his body for barely enough money to keep them housed and fed. The grinding routine of poverty that felt like drowning in slow motion. And he thought about the woman sitting at his kitchen table who'd had everything stolen from her by people powerful enough to rewrite reality itself, who'd survived 6 months of hell and still had the strength to imagine fighting back. I have to go to work, Daniel said finally, not turning around. I can't call in sick. We need the money, and I can't risk losing this job. But tonight, when I get home, we're going to talk through every detail of this plan, every risk, every contingency, every possible way it could go wrong. And if I decide to help you with this, you need to understand something. He turned to face her now and saw that Ivy was watching him with an intensity that suggested she was holding her breath. If we do this, we do it smart. We do it careful. And we do it in a way that keeps Emma safe no matter what happens. She's not just my daughter, she's my entire world. And I will not let her lose her father because I made a stupid decision trying to play hero. Daniel's voice hardened. So if you have any doubt about whether this can be done safely, if there's any chance this puts her at risk, you tell me now. Because I'll walk away from helping you before I'll gamble with her future. Ivy stood up slowly, and for the first time since she'd appeared in his bathroom, Daniel saw something other than desperation in her eyes. Respect, maybe. Understanding. I would never ask you to risk your daughter. Never. And if we do this, when we do this, we do it in a way that keeps you completely protected. If something goes wrong, if we get caught, it's all on me. You were just a good Samaritan who let a homeless woman use his bathroom, who didn't know what I was planning. I'll make sure of that. That's not how this works, Daniel said. If we're partners in this, we're partners in everything, including the consequences. Partners? Ivy repeated, and something like a smile flickered across her bruised face. I haven't had a partner in anything for a very long time. Daniel glanced at his phone again. 20 minutes until he needed to leave. The laptop stays here. Keep it hidden, in my bedroom closet, under some boxes. If anyone comes to the door, you hide until they leave. There's food in the fridge and pantry, not much, but enough. Don't answer the phone if it rings. Don't go outside, just stay invisible, Ivy finished. I know how. He grabbed his work jacket, his keys, his thermos that needed refilling with coffee he didn't have time to make. At the door, he paused and looked back at Ivy, at this stranger who'd crashed into his life and was asking him to become a criminal in pursuit of justice. If I come home and find out you've stolen from me or hurt Emma in any way, or that any of this was a lie, you'll call the police and press charges, and I'll deserve everything I get, Ivy said. I know, but Daniel, I'm not lying, and I'm not crazy. And if you help me do this, if we can actually expose what they did, it won't just be justice for me. It'll be justice for every client they stole from, every person whose retirement they destroyed, every family whose future they gambled away for their own profit. Daniel nodded once, sharply, and headed out into the rain. The drive to the distribution center where he worked passed in a blur of streetlights and traffic, his mind already spinning through scenarios and risks, and the 1,000 ways that Ivy's plan could destroy everything he'd worked to build. His phone buzzed with the usual pre-shift message from his supervisor, a curt reminder about package quotas and efficiency metrics, and Daniel stared at the words with something close to hatred. This was his life, loading trucks and carrying boxes for a corporation that measured his worth in packages per hour, that would replace him in a heartbeat if he showed any sign of weakness or humanity. That paid him just barely enough to survive, while executives somewhere in a glass tower made decisions about efficiency, optimization, and profit margins. And in his house right now sat a woman with evidence that another corporation, one with corner offices and investment portfolios and the veneer of legitimate business, was systematically robbing people while hiding behind spreadsheets and bureaucracy. The shift passed with excruciating slowness, each hour crawling by while Daniel's hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, scan, load, stack, repeat, and his mind churned through possibilities. Breaking into an office building was a crime. Getting caught would mean arrest, prosecution, possibly prison time. Emma would go into foster care. He'd lose everything. But if they didn't do it, if they just took Ivy's photographs to the FBI and hoped for the best, what were the odds that anything would actually happen? That investigators would take seriously the claims of a homeless woman against a major financial firm? That justice would somehow prevail when the entire system seemed designed to protect people with money and power while grinding everyone else into dust? His phone buzzed during his dinner break, a text from Diane asking if Emma could come over for dinner since Daniel was working late. He texted back his grateful acceptance, relieved that his daughter would be safe and fed and far away from whatever complications the evening might bring. Another text came through moments later from Emma herself, probably using Diane's phone. Love you, Daddy. I got a B+ on my math test. Daniel stared at those words for a long moment, at the pride and affection packed into a simple text message, and felt the weight of his responsibilities settle heavier. Everything he did, every risk he took, every choice he made, all of it rippled out to touch his daughter's life. He couldn't afford to be reckless. But maybe, just maybe, he couldn't afford to be too cautious either. The shift finally ended at 11, and Daniel drove home through empty streets with the radio off, preferring silence to the cheerful noise of late-night DJs. The house was dark when he pulled up, except for a single light burning in the kitchen window. He sat in the car for a moment, gathering himself, preparing for the conversation that would determine whether he stayed the course of his careful, controlled life or veered into territory that terrified him. Ivy was sitting at the kitchen table again, the laptop closed in front of her, a notepad covered in dense handwriting beside it. She'd clearly been working all day. The notepad showed diagrams, schedules, lists of equipment, and timing. She looked up as Daniel entered, and he saw that the desperation had been replaced by something else entirely. Focus, purpose. "I've mapped it all out," she said without preamble. "Building access, security rotations, the location of Thomas's office, the fastest routes in and out. I've identified a 4-hour window on Saturday night when security is minimized and the cleaning crews have finished. We'd need basic equipment, a laptop, a scanner, gloves, dark clothes. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that would raise suspicions if anyone saw us buying it." Daniel set down his thermos and jacket, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "Saturday night, that's 3 days from now. The longer we wait, the more chance they have to find me. To realize I'm not dead or gone, that I might still be a threat." Ivy's voice was urgent but controlled. "I've been watching the news, monitoring their stock price online. Everything looks normal right now. They think they got away with it. But if I surface, if they realize I'm still out there, they'll destroy evidence, shut down accounts, scatter before we can touch them. And if we get caught—" "We won't," Ivy interrupted, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. You're right to consider that possibility. If we get caught, I take full responsibility. I'll say I coerced you, threatened you, made you think I had dangerous connections. I'll make it clear you were an innocent dupe helping someone you thought was in real danger." "That's not—" Daniel stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what happens to Emma if her father goes to prison. What happens to the life I've spent 7 years building? What happens to the promises I made to be there for her, to keep her safe, to be the parent she deserves?" Ivy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened. "You want me to tell you it's safe? That there's no risk? That you can help me and nothing bad will happen?" She shook her head slowly. "I can't promise that. All I can tell you is that I've thought through every detail, that I've minimized every risk I can identify, and that if we do this right, the chances of getting caught are minimal." "But not zero." "But not zero," Ivy agreed. "Nothing in life is zero risk. You know that better than most people. You drive for a living, you work in a warehouse where people get injured, you raise a child alone in a world full of dangers you can't control. Every day you're making calculations about acceptable risk. This is just—" she gestured at the notepad, "a different kind of calculation." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, staring at the diagrams and lists that Ivy had created. "Walk me through it, everything, start to finish." And so she did. For the next 2 hours, Ivy laid out her plan with the kind of meticulous detail that suggested she'd been living it in her mind for months. The building's security system that relied more on cameras than guards. The keycard access points and how they could be bypassed using maintenance codes she'd memorized. The location of Thomas's office on the 14th floor and the route from the elevator that avoided camera coverage. The safe in his office that she'd watched him open enough times to know the type, the model, the potential combinations based on his birthday, and other personal numbers she'd memorized as part of her job. She showed him photographs on the laptop, images she'd pulled from her memory of the building's layout, marked with potential routes and timing. She'd factored in how long it would take to scan documents, how many files they'd need to copy to build an ironclad case, where they'd store the evidence once they had it. "We go in as a cleaning crew," Ivy explained, pointing to a note on her pad. "There are companies that do after-hours commercial cleaning. We dress the part, dark pants, polo shirts, nothing that stands out. Carry equipment that looks legitimate. The actual cleaning company finishes by 9 on Saturday nights. We go in at midnight when the building's essentially empty, except for security in the lobby. And if security stops us? We're new hires picking up an emergency call. A client complained about the 14th floor bathrooms. We have a work order, a clipboard, the right uniform. Security mostly watches cameras and logs entries. They're not going to physically check every cleaner who comes through, especially if we look professional and act like we belong. Daniel studied the plan, searching for holes, for the places where confidence would meet reality and shatter. The office safe. You really think you can open it? I watched Thomas do it at least 30 times during the months I worked for him. He was careless, thought I wasn't paying attention, or maybe he just didn't think an assistant was capable of remembering numbers. But I am. Ivy's jaw tightened. I remember everything about those months, every detail of that office, every conversation I overheard, every time he smiled at me like I was too stupid to understand what was happening right in front of my face. I remember it all. The bitterness in her voice was palpable, years of anger compressed into a few quiet words. Daniel recognized that tone. He'd heard it in his own voice on the worst nights, when the exhaustion and futility of his life felt overwhelming, when he wondered if Emma would grow up to resent the limited world he could provide for her. If we do this, Daniel said slowly, and we actually manage to get the evidence, then what? We can't just walk into a police station with stolen documents. We don't go to local police. They might have connections, people on Meridian's payroll. We go federal, FBI, Securities and Exchange Commission, maybe even send copies to journalists at major newspapers. Ivy had clearly thought through this part too. We make the evidence so public, so widely distributed that they can't contain it, can't threaten it away or bury it with lawyers. We create a situation where they have to investigate, where the pressure is too great to ignore. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the full weight of what they were discussing. This wasn't just about helping a desperate woman anymore. It was about deliberately choosing to break the law in pursuit of justice that the legal system seemed designed to prevent. It was about becoming the kind of person who took matters into his own hands, because waiting for proper channels meant waiting forever. I need to think, he said finally. Tonight, tomorrow. I need to sit with this and make sure I'm not just tired and stupid and caught up in something that feels meaningful in the moment, but that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Ivy nodded, and Daniel saw that she'd expected this, had probably prepared herself for rejection. That's fair. Take whatever time you need. But Daniel, if you decide you can't do this, I understand. I'll take what we have to the FBI tomorrow and hope for the best. And I'll leave, and you'll never have to think about any of this again. Where would you go? The question came out before Daniel could stop it. Ivy smiled, but there was no humor in it. Back to being invisible. Back to trying to survive one more day, and then another, and another, until either they find me, or I find a way to stop being afraid. She looked down at her hands. I'm grateful for what you've already done. The food, the shelter, the belief when I gave you almost no reason to believe. That's more than I had any right to expect. Daniel stood abruptly, suddenly unable to sit still. He walked to the window, to the door, around the small kitchen in restless circles while his mind turned over possibilities and risks and consequences. He thought about Emma's math test, about her pride in that B+, about the future he wanted to build for her, one where effort mattered, where fairness existed, where people who did wrong actually faced consequences. And he thought about what he'd be teaching her if he turned away from this. That safety meant never taking risks, that justice wasn't worth fighting for if it meant personal cost, that the world's cruelty should be accepted rather than challenged. Saturday night, Daniel said, and heard how his voice had changed, how the decision had already been made somewhere deep in his gut, even while his brain scrambled to catch up. We do this Saturday night, but we do it exactly like you outlined. Professional, careful, smart. And if anything feels wrong, if any part of the plan starts falling apart, we abort immediately. No heroics, no improvisation. We stick to the plan or we walk away. Agreed? Ivy was standing now too, her eyes wide, hope and fear warring on her face. Agreed, I promise. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all. Then we have 3 days to prepare. Daniel felt adrenaline beginning to replace exhaustion, the strange energy that came from finally committing to a course of action after hours of indecision. Tomorrow you write down every detail you can remember about that office, that building, that safe. Every password, every code, every piece of information that might help. And I figure out what to tell Diane about Saturday night, how to make sure Emma is safe and taken care of and completely insulated from whatever we're about to do. And then? Ivy's voice was barely above a whisper. And then we go steal your evidence back, Daniel said. And we hope like hell that doing the wrong thing for the right reasons doesn't destroy us both in the process. The 3 days that followed moved with the strange duality of time under pressure, simultaneously crawling forward with agonizing slowness while also rushing past too quickly, each hour bringing them closer to Saturday night and the point of no return. Daniel went through the motions of his normal life with the dissociative feeling of an actor performing a role, loading trucks and driving routes, while his mind ran through scenarios and contingencies, playing parent to Emma while calculating risk to her future, smiling at neighbors while hiding a stranger in his house who was planning a federal crime. Thursday morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Ivy while Emma ate breakfast in her room, watching cartoons on the small television he'd allowed her as a special treat. The laptop was open between them, and Ivy was sketching the 14th floor layout from memory, her hand moving with surprising precision as she recreated hallways and office placements from months-old recollections. "Thomas's office is here," she said, tapping a point on her diagram near the corner of the building. Corner office, windows on 2 sides, which means natural light that might be visible from outside if we're not careful with flashlights. Her finger traced a path from the elevator bank. 3 cameras in the hallway, here, here, and here. But there's a blind spot if you stay close to the eastern wall, and the cleaning closet is positioned right at the edge of camera coverage. Daniel studied the sketch, committing it to memory. The safe. Where exactly? Behind a painting of the Portland waterfront, original artwork cost probably $20,000, which Thomas loved to mention to clients. Ivy's voice carried the edge of contempt. The painting is hinged, swings open on the left side. The safe is a Sentry Safe executive model, electronic keypad, probably 8-digit code. I watched him open it enough times to see his pattern. His fingers always moved the same way. 2 digits, pause, 3 digits, pause, 3 more digits. But you don't know the actual numbers. Not definitively, but I know Thomas. I know his patterns, his ego, the way he thought. Ivy pulled out her notepad, flipped to a page covered in number sequences. His birthday is March 15th, 1978. His daughter's birthday is June 6th, 2012. His wedding anniversary is October 23rd. I've worked out every possible 8-digit combination using those dates, plus variations with lucky numbers he mentioned, addresses from his emergency contact form, anything that might have personal significance. Daniel counted the entries on her page. That's at least 30 different combinations. 32, Ivy confirmed, which sounds like a lot, but most electronic safes have a reset delay of only a few seconds between failed attempts. If we're systematic, we can work through all of them in maybe 15 minutes, 20 at most. And if none of them work? Ivy met his eyes, and Daniel saw the vulnerability beneath her careful planning. Then we leave empty-handed and hope the photographs from my phone are enough to convince someone to investigate. But I don't think it'll come to that. I spent 14 months watching Thomas. I know how his mind works. The code will be something meaningful to him, something that makes him feel clever for choosing while actually being predictable. The conviction in her voice was reassuring, but Daniel had learned through hard experience that confidence didn't equal certainty. Still, they'd committed to this path, and there was a certain relief in moving forward rather than remaining paralyzed by endless what-ifs. He took the notepad from Ivy and studied the number sequences, trying to see patterns, to understand the logic of a man he'd never met but whose secrets they'd soon be stealing. Emma's laughter drifted from her bedroom, some cartoon character doing something absurd, and the sound pierced Daniel's concentration like a knife. This was what he was risking. This joy, this innocence, this child who trusted him completely. If everything went wrong on Saturday night, if they were caught and arrested and prosecuted, Emma would lose her father. She'd go into the foster system, bounced between temporary homes, growing up with the knowledge that her daddy had chosen to help a stranger over staying safe for her. "You're thinking about your daughter," Ivy said quietly, and Daniel realized his hands had clenched into fists on the table. "Every minute of every day," Daniel said. "Even when I'm not consciously thinking about her, she's there. Every decision runs through the filter of what's best for Emma, what keeps her safe, what kind of father I'm being." Ivy was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a carefulness that suggested she was choosing her words precisely. I had a daughter too, or almost did. I was 6 months pregnant when I started working at Meridian Capital. She paused, and Daniel saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. The stress of the job, the long hours, the constant pressure, I went into premature labor. She was born too early, too small, lived for 3 days in the NICU before her lungs just gave out. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, the immediate empathy of one parent recognizing another's deepest pain. Ivy, I'm sorry. I didn't know. How could you? I never mentioned it. Most people don't want to hear about dead babies, makes them uncomfortable, makes them not know what to say. Ivy's voice had gone flat, distant, as if she was recounting someone else's story. Her name was Lily. I held her while she died. The nurses were kind about it, gave me privacy, time, didn't rush me. And then I went back to work 2 weeks later because I needed the health insurance to pay off the medical bills, needed the job to survive, needed to keep moving because stopping meant drowning in grief. Jesus, Daniel breathed. So when I tell you, I understand what you're risking, what your daughter means to you. I'm not just saying words. I know exactly what it means to be a parent, to carry that weight, to make every choice through the lens of protecting your child. Ivy finally looked up at him, and her eyes were wet, but her voice remained steady. And I would never, ever ask you to do something that puts Emma in real danger. If I thought this plan had a genuine chance of taking you away from her, I'd walk away right now. But I have to believe, that we can do this and both walk away free. Because if we can't, then everything I've survived for the last 6 months has been for nothing. The vulnerability in her confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrible. Daniel wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the weight of her loss, but he'd learned years ago that grief like that didn't respond to platitudes. Instead, he just nodded, acknowledging the shared understanding between two people who'd both learned that love meant carrying impossible burdens and making choices that felt like losing pieces of yourself. We do this for Lily too then, Daniel said finally. For every person who got crushed by systems that were supposed to protect them. For everyone who played by the rules and got destroyed anyway. Ivy's eyes widened slightly, and Daniel saw gratitude flash across her features. Not for the sentiment itself, but for being seen, for having her daughter acknowledged as someone who'd mattered, whose brief existence had meant something beyond statistics and medical records. For Lily, she agreed quietly, and for Emma. To build a world where maybe kids like her grow up with a little more justice and a little less cruelty. The moment stretched between them, heavy with shared purpose and the strange intimacy that came from unlikely partnerships forged in crisis. Then Emma called from her room, something about being ready for school, and the spell broke, reality reasserting itself in the form of morning routines and practical necessities. The days continued their strange march forward. Daniel worked his shifts with mechanical precision, his body performing familiar tasks while his mind remained elsewhere, running through the plan until he could visualize every step, every movement, every potential point of failure. His coworkers noticed his distraction. One of the veteran drivers asked if he was feeling all right, if something was wrong at home. And Daniel manufactured some story about Emma having trouble at school, about parent-teacher conferences and behavioral concerns. The lie came easily, and that ease troubled him, made him wonder how many other small deceptions would become necessary as he moved further from the person he'd been just days ago. Ivy spent her time preparing with the focused intensity of someone who'd been waiting months for this opportunity. She wrote out detailed instructions for every scenario they might encounter, memorized security schedules until she could recite them without hesitation, studied photographs of the building's exterior to identify sightlines and potential witnesses. Daniel watched her transform from the desperate, broken woman who'd appeared in his bathroom into something sharper, more dangerous, and he wondered what she'd been like before Meridian Capital had destroyed her life. Competent, obviously, intelligent, the kind of person who noticed details and connected patterns and refused to ignore inconvenient truths. Friday evening, Daniel sat Emma down for a conversation he'd been dreading all week. They were in the living room, Emma curled up on the couch with her elephant, Daniel sitting close enough to see the curiosity and slight wariness in her eyes. At 7 years old, she'd already learned that serious conversations usually meant bad news or difficult changes. "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about tomorrow night, Daniel began, keeping his voice gentle and calm. I have to help a friend with something important. It's going to take a few hours, and I'm going to need you to stay with Miss Diane. Emma's face scrunched up with immediate suspicion. What friend? You don't have friends, just work people, and me and Miss Diane. The observation stung with its accuracy. Daniel's social isolation was complete and deliberate. Friends required time and emotional energy he couldn't spare, risked complications he couldn't afford. She's someone I met recently who needs help with a work problem. It's complicated grown-up stuff, but it's important, and I promised I'd help. Is it the lady? Emma asked, and Daniel felt his heart stop for a moment. What lady? The one I heard in the kitchen the other morning, when you told me to stay in my room. Emma wasn't accusing, just stating facts with the straightforward logic of childhood. I heard you talking to someone, a woman. Her voice sounded sad. Daniel had underestimated his daughter's perceptiveness, had assumed that closed doors and quiet voices would be enough. He should have known better. Emma had spent her entire life in close quarters with him, had learned to read his moods and tensions like a survival skill. Yes, he admitted, because lying seemed worse than carefully curated truth. She's going through a hard time, and I'm trying to help. But that's all you need to know right now, okay? Grown-up problems that you don't need to worry about. Is she in trouble? Like danger trouble? Emma's eyes had gone wide, and Daniel saw real fear there, the kind that came from a child who'd already lost one parent and understood on some instinctive level how fragile security could be. No, baby, nothing like that. Just someone who needs help figuring out some complicated work stuff, and tomorrow night is when we have to do it. But Daniel pulled Emma closer, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. But here's what's important. You're going to be safe with Miss Diane, exactly like always. You'll have dinner there, watch movies, probably get spoiled with more dessert than I usually let you have. And I'll be back before you wake up Sunday morning, and everything will be normal. I promise. You promise? Emma's voice had gone small, vulnerable in the way that broke Daniel's heart. I promise, Daniel said, and hoped desperately that it wasn't a promise he'd break. Have I ever let you down? Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. No, she admitted finally. You always come home. Even when you're really tired and it's really late, you always come home. Exactly. And tomorrow night will be no different. I'll help my friend, and then I'll come home, and Sunday we'll make pancakes, and you can tell me about your sleepover at Miss Diane's. Daniel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Deal? Deal, Emma agreed, though Daniel could still see worry in her eyes, could feel the tension in her small body. She trusted him, but she wasn't stupid. She knew something was different, something was wrong, even if she couldn't articulate what. Later that night, after Emma was asleep and Ivy had retreated to the couch that had become her temporary sanctuary, Daniel stood in his bedroom and stared at the clothes laid out on his bed. Dark jeans, a black polo shirt he'd bought years ago for a job interview at a slightly better company, work boots that were scuffed and anonymous. The costume of someone who belonged in an office building after hours, who could pass as maintenance or cleaning staff, who would blend into shadows and be forgotten by anyone who happened to see them. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane confirming that Emma could sleep over Saturday night, adding that she was happy to help and not to worry about what time he picked Emma up in the morning. Daniel stared at those words, not to worry, and felt the bitter irony. Diane was a good woman, kind and generous, who saw his request as just another single parent needing childcare support. She had no idea she was providing cover for a crime, no idea that her kindness was enabling something that could shatter multiple lives if it went wrong. The weight of accumulated deception pressed down on Daniel's shoulders, and for a moment he let himself imagine backing out, calling it off, telling Ivy that he couldn't do this, that the risk was too great, that she'd have to find another way, taking the photograph she'd recovered to the FBI and hoping for the best, returning to his normal life of exhausting work and careful poverty and the small daily victories of keeping Emma fed and safe and loved. But he knew he wouldn't do that. Not because he was brave or principled or noble, but because somewhere in the last few days, Ivy's fight had become his fight. Her hunger for justice had infected him with the dangerous belief that maybe individual actions could matter, that maybe refusing to accept injustice was worth the risk, that maybe teaching Emma through example was more important than teaching her through caution. Daniel changed into old sweatpants and a t-shirt, his sleeping clothes, and climbed into bed with his phone in hand. He scrolled through news sites, searching for any mention of Meridian Capital Management, any hint that the company was under investigation or that Ivy's photographs had somehow already triggered scrutiny. But there was nothing, just the usual background noise of financial news and corporate press releases. Meridian Capital, existing in that comfortable middle tier of companies successful enough to be stable but not prominent enough to attract much attention. Tomorrow night, that could change. Tomorrow night, they'd either succeed in exposing a massive fraud, or they'd fail spectacularly and face consequences Daniel couldn't afford to fully imagine. There was no middle ground, no partial success. Either they walked away with evidence that would demolish Meridian Capital's criminal operations, or they walked away with nothing, or they didn't walk away at all. Sleep came reluctantly, his mind too wired to fully shut down. And when he finally drifted off, it was into anxious dreams of locked doors and endless hallways and Emma's voice calling for him from somewhere he couldn't reach. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Portland winter day that felt like the sun had forgotten to rise properly. Daniel made Emma her favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes that were more dessert than meal, and tried to project normalcy while his stomach churned with nerves. Emma seemed to sense something was off, staying unusually quiet during breakfast, watching him with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "Daddy, are you scared?" she asked suddenly, syrup smeared across her cheek. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Daniel's first instinct was to deny it, to maintain the fiction that adults were never afraid, never uncertain. But Emma deserved better than lies, deserved the truth, even when it was complicated. "A little bit," he admitted. "Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that are scary but important. That's part of being responsible. Like when I had to give my presentation at school, even though I was really nervous." Emma's frame of reference was limited, but her understanding was profound. "Exactly like that," Daniel said, relieved by the parallel. "You were nervous, but you did it anyway because it was important. And you did great, remember? That's what bravery is. Not being unafraid, but doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Emma nodded seriously, processing this wisdom with the gravity she brought to life lessons. "Okay, then I'll be brave tonight too. At Miss Diane's. Even if it feels weird that you're not there." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion, with love for this small person who trusted him so completely, who was willing to be brave because she believed her father's choices were sound. "That's my girl," he managed to say. "You're the bravest person I know." The afternoon passed in a haze of final preparations. Ivy went over the plan one more time, her voice steady and confident, outlining contingencies and backup strategies until Daniel's head spun with details. They synchronized their watches, cheap digital ones Daniel had bought at a drugstore, nothing that could be traced or tracked. They packed a small backpack with supplies, a portable scanner, gloves, a flashlight with a red filter to minimize visibility, a clipboard with fake work orders in case they were questioned. At 4 o'clock, Daniel drove Emma to Diane's house 3 blocks away, carrying her overnight bag and listening to her chatter about the movies she wanted to watch and whether Miss Diane would let her stay up past her bedtime. Diane met them at the door with her usual warm smile, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from Daniel's shoulders. "Don't worry about a thing," Diane said, ushering Emma inside. "We'll have a wonderful evening, won't we, sweetheart? And Daniel, you take your time. Get some rest. You look exhausted." "Thank you," Daniel said, and meant it more than Diane could possibly understand. "I'll be by in the morning to pick her up." He hugged Emma goodbye, holding on longer than usual, breathing in her presence, and trying to memorize the feeling in case this was the last normal moment they'd ever have together. Emma squeezed back hard, then pulled away with the resilience of childhood, already turning toward the promise of a fun evening with her favorite neighbor. Back at his house, Ivy was dressed in the clothes they'd assembled, dark pants and a navy polo shirt with a generic professional services logo Daniel had printed onto iron-on transfer paper. She looked the part of a contract worker, anonymous and forgettable. And when Daniel changed into his matching outfit, he saw the same transformation in the bathroom mirror. He looked like 1,000 other service workers moving through Portland's buildings after hours, invisible labor keeping the machinery of commerce running. "We leave at 11, Ivy said, checking her watch for the third time in as many minutes. "That gives us time to drive downtown, park on a side street, walk to the building, and arrive right around midnight. The Saturday night security guard does his rounds at 11:45 and then returns to the lobby desk. We go in during that window when he's most settled, least attentive." Daniel nodded, his mouth too dry for speech. The next few hours crawled by with excruciating slowness, both of them too nervous to eat properly, too anxious to do anything but wait and review and imagine everything that could go wrong. Daniel tried to watch television, but couldn't focus on the images flickering across the screen. Ivy sat with her notepad, writing and rewriting the safe combinations until the paper was smudged with graphite. At 10:30, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Emma's asleep. All good here? Take your time tomorrow." He stared at those words, at the cheerful assurance that his daughter was safe and cared for, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do. If he was caught tonight, if this all went catastrophically wrong, that might be the last innocent moment Emma experienced, falling asleep at a neighbor's house, trusting that her father would return in the morning like he always did. "It's time," Ivy said quietly, and Daniel looked up to see her standing by the door, backpack in hand, her face set with determination that didn't quite hide the fear underneath. "Are you ready?" Daniel stood on legs that felt unsteady, checked his pockets for the third time, keys, wallet, phone, gloves, and met Ivy's eyes. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." They drove downtown in Daniel's Honda, the streets quieter than usual for a Saturday night. Portland's nightlife concentrated in different neighborhoods. Daniel took side streets when he could, avoiding main drags and their cameras, parking finally on a residential block 4 blocks from Meridian Capital's building. The walk through cold night air helped clear his head, helped him focus on the immediate tasks rather than the larger implications of what they were attempting. The Meridian Capital building rose 30 stories into the dark sky, glass and steel reflecting the city lights, imposing in its corporate anonymity. Daniel and Ivy approached from the east side, staying close to other buildings, moving with the purposeful stride of people who belonged, who had every right to be there. Through the lobby windows, Daniel could see the security desk, could make out the guard sitting with his back to the street, attention on something in front of him, probably his phone, Daniel guessed, or a small television. "Shift change was at 11, Ivy murmured, her voice barely audible. "This guard is older, less motivated. He'll check our IDs if we approach the desk, but if we look professional and confident, he probably won't scrutinize them closely." They paused at the corner, watching the building for a long moment, and Daniel felt the last opportunity to turn back slipping away. Once they entered that lobby, once they engaged with security, they'd be committed. There would be cameras recording their faces, logs documenting their presence, a trail of evidence that could destroy them if anything went wrong. "Last chance," Daniel said quietly. "We can still walk away. Take the photos to the FBI on Monday and let them handle it." Ivy turned to look at him, and in the dim streetlight, Daniel saw absolute conviction in her expression. "I've been walking away for 6 months. Every day, every hour, just trying to survive and hoping someone else would fix what was broken. But no one's coming to save me, Daniel. No one cares about a homeless woman's accusations against a successful company. If we don't do this, if I don't fight back now, then I'll spend the rest of my life running from shadows and knowing I had a chance to make this right and chose safety instead." She paused. "But this is your choice, your life, your daughter. If you want to walk away, I'll understand. I'll go in alone." "No," Daniel said, and heard the finality in his own voice. "We do this together, or not at all." That was the deal. Ivy nodded once, sharply, and then they were moving again, crossing the street toward the building's entrance, stepping into the light and the cameras and the point of no return. The glass doors yielded easily to Ivy's push, and then they were inside the lobby, marble floors and modern art, and the security desk ahead, where an older man in a uniform looked up with mild interest. "Help you folks?" His voice carried the bored patience of someone doing a job that rarely involved actual security concerns. Ivy stepped forward confidently, clipboard in hand. Evening. We're with professional services. Got an emergency call about the 14th floor bathrooms. Complaint came in this afternoon about a water issue that needs immediate attention. She handed over the fake work order Daniel had created, and the guard glanced at it with minimal interest, then looked at their uniforms, their equipment, their practiced air of mundane competence. "You'll need to sign in," he said, pushing a logbook across the desk. "IDs?" Daniel and Ivy handed over their driver's licenses, and the guard copied down their names and ID numbers with careful penmanship, taking his time in a way that made Daniel's heart hammer against his ribs. But then he was handing back their licenses and gesturing toward the elevator bank. "14th floor, building closes at 2 a.m., so make sure you're out by then." "Shouldn't take more than an hour," Ivy said smoothly. "Thanks for your help." And just like that, they were through. Walking across the lobby toward the elevators, every muscle in Daniel's body screaming that this was wrong, that they should run, that they were about to be stopped and questioned and arrested. But nothing happened. The guard returned his attention to his phone, and Daniel and Ivy stepped into an elevator, and the doors slid closed with a soft chime that sounded like a cell door locking. "We're in," Ivy breathed, and Daniel saw that her hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally overwhelming the careful control she'd maintained. "Oh God, we're actually doing this." The elevator rose smoothly through the building, numbers ticking upward on the display, and Daniel watched their reflection in the polished steel doors. Two people in matching uniforms, carrying equipment, looking like they belonged. Looking like exactly the kind of invisible labor force that kept buildings running, while the powerful people who worked in them slept safely in their expensive homes. The doors opened on the 14th floor, and they stepped out into a hallway lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in dim, shadowy relief. Ivy's hand found Daniel's briefly, squeezed once, and then released. "This way," she whispered, and led him down the corridor toward a corner office where Thomas Carver's secrets waited to be stolen, where evidence of systematic theft waited to be recovered, where Daniel Brooks's life was about to change irrevocably one way or another. The 14th floor stretched before them in dim emergency lighting, all sleek corporate surfaces and expensive silence. Daniel's heart hammered so loudly in his ears that he was certain it must be audible, certain that some alarm somewhere was registering the thundering proof of his terror. But the hallway remained quiet, empty, just another after-hours office space waiting for Monday's return to purpose and noise. Ivy moved with unexpected confidence now that they were inside, her earlier trembling replaced by focused intensity. She stayed close to the eastern wall exactly as she'd described, navigating the camera blind spots with the precision of someone who'd mentally rehearsed this route 1,000 times. Daniel followed, acutely aware of every sound, the soft squeak of his work boots on polished floor, the rustle of the backpack against his shoulders, his own breathing that seemed impossibly loud in the sterile corporate silence. "There," Ivy whispered, pointing toward a door at the corridor's end. Brass nameplate catching the emergency light. Thomas Carver, VP Investment Operations. The portal to everything they'd risked so much to reach. Daniel pulled on the latex gloves they'd brought, watched Ivy do the same, the practical criminality of the gesture making everything suddenly, viscerally real. They weren't just service workers anymore. They were burglars, trespassers, thieves stealing evidence that might vindicate them or condemn them depending on who told the story afterward. Ivy reached into her pocket and pulled out a key card, one she'd kept from her employment, one she'd carried through 6 months of homelessness, like a talisman. "I told them I lost this during my termination," she said quietly, sliding it through the reader beside Carver's door. "Reported it stolen, filled out the paperwork, watched them cancel it in the system. But Thomas was arrogant, thought I was too stupid to have made a copy first." The light on the reader flashed green, and she pushed the door open with a soft click. He was wrong. The office beyond was everything corporate wealth aspired to be, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a nighttime view of Portland's downtown, furniture that probably cost more than Daniel earned in 6 months, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes that looked impressive and unread. The space smelled like expensive cologne and furniture polish, and the particular sterility of places where actual human struggle never penetrated. Daniel felt a surge of anger so sudden and intense it nearly took his breath away. This was what Meridian Capital had built with stolen money, corner offices and original artwork, and the insulated comfort of people who'd never worried about making rent or feeding their children, or whether one unexpected expense would topple their entire precarious existence. Thomas Carver sat in this office and moved millions of dollars around like playing pieces, while people like Ivy lost everything for daring to notice the theft. "The painting is there," Ivy said, pointing to a large canvas on the wall opposite the windows. The Portland waterfront rendered in aggressive brushstrokes and sunset colors. The kind of art that cost a fortune because someone had decided it should, not because it actually moved the soul. "Help me move it." They approached the painting together, and Ivy ran her gloved fingers along its left edge until she found the hidden hinge. The canvas swung open smoothly, revealing the safe set into the wall behind it. A Century-safe executive model, exactly as Ivy had described, its electronic keypad glowing with faint blue light in the darkened office. "Okay," Ivy breathed, pulling out her notepad with the list of possible combinations. Her hands were shaking again now, and Daniel saw her fighting to steady them, to maintain the control that had gotten them this far. First combination, his birthday straight, 31578. Then we try variations. She punched in the numbers with careful deliberation. The safe beeped, its light flashing red. Access denied. "Next one," Ivy said, her voice tighter now. "Birthday reversed, 87513. Another beep. Another red flash. Daniel glanced at his watch. They'd been on this floor for 4 minutes. The security guard expected them to be working on bathroom repairs for up to an hour, but every minute they spent in Carver's office was a minute closer to discovery, to catastrophe. Ivy continued through her list methodically. Daughter's birthday, wedding anniversary, variations and combinations, and each failed attempt seemed to tighten the tension in the room like a physical force. 8 tries, 10, 15. The safe's beeps began to sound like accusations, mocking their naivety and thinking they could simply walk in and steal evidence from a man who'd built his career on careful control. "It has to be here," Ivy muttered, and Daniel heard desperation creeping into her voice. "I watched him. I know these numbers meant something to him. Stop," Daniel said quietly. "Just breathe for a second. Think. What did you actually see when you watched him open it?" Ivy closed her eyes, and Daniel saw her forcing herself to calm down, to move past panic into memory. His fingers moved in a pattern. 2 digits, pause, 3 digits, pause, 3 digits. The rhythm was consistent. He wasn't thinking hard about it. It was muscle memory. "What did Thomas care about most?" Daniel asked. "What did he mention constantly? What was he proud of?" "The company, his position, his—" Ivy's eyes snapped open. "The investment returns." He was obsessed with the numbers he was showing clients, the impossible returns that made him look brilliant. He had them memorized, quoted them in meetings constantly. What were they? 12.3% annual returns. Ivy was already turning back to the safe, her hands steadier now. That's what he told every client. 12.3% year after year, steady as clockwork. It was part of the fraud, returns so consistent they should have been impossible, but clients trusted them because they seemed conservative enough to be real. She punched in the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 3. The safe's light flashed yellow for a heart-stopping moment, processing, and then turned green. The lock mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet office. "Oh my God," Ivy whispered. "Oh my God, we're in." Daniel pulled the safe door open, revealing stacks of documents inside, file folders, bound reports, USB drives organized in a small box. Ivy began pulling items out with shaking hands, scanning covers and titles, her breathing coming faster as she recognized what they'd found. "These are the original client contracts," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The real ones, not the sanitized versions they file with regulators. Look, here's proof of the offshore accounts, the shell companies they used to hide the funds, and these—" She held up a bound report. "Internal audits showing they knew exactly what they were doing. They documented their own crimes." Daniel pulled the portable scanner from the backpack and began setting it up on Carver's desk, his hands moving quickly despite his nerves. "We scan everything. Every page, every document, multiple copies stored in multiple locations. By tomorrow, this evidence needs to be so distributed they can't possibly contain it." They worked with frantic efficiency, Ivy feeding documents through the scanner while Daniel monitored the time and listened for any sound from the hallway beyond. 10 minutes passed. 20. The scanner's soft mechanical whir seemed deafening, each page processed feeling like another chance for discovery, for security to appear in the doorway demanding explanations they couldn't provide. Ivy pulled out a USB drive labeled Executive Communications Confidential and plugged it into Carver's computer, which they'd powered on using a password she remembered from her assistant days. The screen filled with emails, and as Daniel read over her shoulder, he felt sick at the casual cruelty documented there. Messages between Carver and other executives discussing problem clients who asked too many questions, strategies for placating suspicious investors with fabricated documentation, a particularly chilling email chain about Ivy herself after she'd started asking questions, deal with the assistant situation immediately, permanently if necessary. We can't afford loose ends. They planned it all, Ivy said, and Daniel heard years of anger compressed into those quiet words. Every step of destroying my life was documented, coordinated, approved by people who signed their names to crimes they thought they'd never face consequences for. Daniel photographed the screen with his phone, capturing multiple emails, building redundancy upon redundancy. The documents in the safe continued to reveal the scope of Meridian Capital's fraud, client lists showing hundreds of people robbed, financial projections showing the scheme extending years into the future, notes about expanding operations to other cities. They'd stolen at least $300 million, probably more. And they'd been so confident in their invulnerability that they'd kept meticulous records, documented everything, created the perfect evidence of their own guilt. We have enough, Daniel said, checking his watch again. They'd been in the office for 38 minutes. More than enough. We need to get out of here before... A sound from the hallway froze them both. Footsteps, voices. Someone approaching the office with the casual rhythm of people who belonged. Daniel and Ivy locked eyes in pure panic, and for a suspended moment neither of them moved, paralyzed by the nightmare scenario they'd hoped would never materialize. The cleaning closet, Ivy hissed, pointing to a door on the office's west side. They gathered documents with desperate speed, shoving everything back into the safe except what they'd already scanned, closing it and swinging the painting back into place. The scanner and laptop went into the backpack, and they'd just reached the closet when they heard the office door beginning to open. They squeezed into the narrow space, barely large enough for both of them, shelves of cleaning supplies pressing against their backs, and Daniel pulled the door closed with agonizing slowness, praying the movement wouldn't be visible to whoever was entering. Through the crack where the door didn't quite seal, he could see into the office, could see two men entering in casual business attire, their conversation mid-flow. One of them was Thomas Carver. Daniel had never seen the man before, but recognized him instantly from Ivy's description. 50s, expensive haircut, the entitled posture of someone who'd spent his entire life having doors opened for him. The other man was older, gray-haired, moving with the careful precision of someone important enough to command attention. The quarterly reports are solid, Carver was saying, moving toward his desk. Clients are satisfied, returns look sustainable. No red flags from regulatory oversight. We're positioned perfectly for expansion into the Seattle market. Good, the older man said. After that situation with your assistant last year, I was concerned we'd drawn unwanted attention, but you handled that cleanly. No loose ends, no complications. Ivy's entire body went rigid against Daniel's, and he felt her trembling with what might have been rage or terror, or both. Here was Thomas Carver discussing her destruction like a minor administrative issue, a problem solved through ruthless efficiency. She was too smart for her own good, Carver said with a laugh that made Daniel's skin crawl. Noticed patterns she should have been too stupid to see. But that's handled now. Last I heard, she'd descended into drugs and petty crime, sleeping under bridges downtown. Tragic what happens to people who can't handle corporate pressure. The casual cruelty of the lie, the rewriting of Ivy's victimization as personal failure, was breathtaking in its calculated precision. This was how they justified their actions, Daniel realized, by convincing themselves that people like Ivy deserved their destruction, that poverty was a character flaw rather than a crime scene. Carver moved toward the painting, and Daniel felt his heart stop completely. But the man simply adjusted its angle slightly, making some small correction to its positioning, then turned back toward his colleague. The new investment portfolio goes live Monday. We've already got 17 clients committed. Total investment around $50 million. Should clear at least $8 million in skimmed funds over the next fiscal year. They were planning to continue, to expand, to steal from more people while Ivy lived on the streets, and Daniel struggled to feed his daughter, and hundreds of other victims never even knew they'd been robbed. The sheer scope of the ongoing crime was staggering, made worse by the comfortable confidence with which these men discussed it. The older man checked his watch. "I need to head out. My wife's expecting me home by 1. You coming? Give me 5 minutes. Want to grab some files for Monday's presentation." Carver moved back toward his desk, started opening drawers, and Daniel felt Ivy's hand find his in the darkness of the closet, squeezing with desperate strength. They stood frozen while Carver gathered documents, while he made a phone call discussing some mundane business matter, while minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Every breath felt too loud, every small movement a potential betrayal. Daniel's legs cramped from standing motionless, his back protesting the awkward angle, but he didn't dare shift position. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Carver seemed satisfied with whatever he'd collected. He turned off his desk lamp, gave the office one last survey, and headed toward the door. "See you Monday," he said to someone in the hallway, and then his footsteps receded, and silence returned like a physical weight lifting. Daniel counted to 60 in his head, then 60 again, making sure they were truly alone before carefully pushing open the closet door. Ivy emerged behind him, her face pale in the emergency lighting, her breathing shallow and rapid with adrenaline crash. "They're still doing it," she said, and her voice shook with barely controlled fury. "Right now, this weekend, they're recruiting new victims. And they're so confident they'll never face consequences that they came here on a Saturday night to discuss it. Which means we need to move faster," Daniel said, checking the hallway through Carver's office door. "Empty now, but for how long? We got what we came for, more than we came for. We heard them confessing to active fraud. But if they're back in the building, that means security might be more alert, might notice things they wouldn't normally catch." They left Carver's office with painful care, making sure everything looked exactly as they'd found it, the safe closed and painting repositioned, no trace of their presence beyond the digital theft that wouldn't be discovered until someone tried to access files that had already been copied and distributed beyond Meridian Capital's ability to contain. The hallway stretched before them again, and this time every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound amplified by heightened nerves. Ivy led them back toward the elevator bank using the same careful route, staying in camera blind spots, moving with the controlled urgency of people finishing a legitimate job. The elevator arrival seemed to take forever, and when the doors finally opened, Daniel half expected to find security waiting inside. But the car was empty, just polished steel and that soft chime, and they stepped inside with the overwhelming relief of having cleared another hurdle. "Lobby," Ivy said quietly as the elevator began descending. "We walk out exactly like we walked in. Professional, bored, just workers finishing an annoying late-night call. The guard won't remember us because we're not memorable." Daniel nodded, unable to trust his voice, watching the floor numbers tick downward. 14, 13, 12. Each number brought them closer to escape or discovery, to freedom or catastrophe, to the moment when they'd know whether this gamble had paid off or destroyed them. The doors opened on the lobby, and there was the security guard at his desk, looking up with the same mild interest he'd shown an hour ago. Daniel and Ivy walked across the marble floor with measured steps, and Daniel forced himself to nod at the guard, to maintain the casual fiction of normalcy. "All finished?" the guard asked. "All set," Ivy confirmed. Turned out to be a minor issue. Easy fix. "Have a good night, then." And just like that, they were past him, pushing through the glass doors into cold night air that felt like absolution, like the first breath after drowning. They walked 2 blocks before either of them spoke, maintaining the professional stride until they were sure no one from the building could see them. Then Ivy stopped abruptly and leaned against a storefront window, her legs seeming to give out all at once. "We did it," she whispered. "Oh my God, Daniel, we actually did it." Daniel pulled her upright before she could slide down the window, acutely aware that sitting on a downtown sidewalk at 1 in the morning would attract exactly the kind of attention they couldn't afford. Not yet. We're not safe until we're home, until this evidence is backed up and distributed, until we've put everything in motion. Keep moving. They made it back to Daniel's car without incident, and as soon as they were inside with doors locked, Daniel allowed himself to feel the full weight of what they'd accomplished and risked. His hand shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline finally having nowhere to go, and he had to take several deep breaths before trusting himself to drive. The trip back to his house passed in surreal quiet, neither of them speaking, both processing trauma and triumph in private silence. Daniel kept checking his mirrors, half convinced they'd see police lights, security vehicles, some consequence manifesting immediately. But the streets remained empty, the night quiet, and when they finally pulled into his driveway, Daniel felt a sob of relief catch in his throat. Inside, they moved with renewed urgency, uploading the scanned documents to multiple cloud storage accounts Ivy had set up using anonymous email addresses and public library computers weeks ago. Each file was copied, renamed, organized into folders that told a complete story of Meridian Capital's fraud. The emails from Carver's computer, the client contracts showing the fake investment schemes, the internal audits proving they knew they were stealing, the executive communications planning Ivy's destruction. "We send copies to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division," Ivy said, typing rapidly on Daniel's laptop. "The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Oregon Attorney General, the Oregonian newspaper, and the Seattle Times and the Wall Street Journal. We make this so public, so widely distributed that they can't bury it or threaten it away." Daniel helped compose the accompanying message, anonymous, factual, directing investigators to specific files, and providing context without revealing their identities. They were careful not to include anything that could trace back to their break-in, framing the evidence as something an insider had leaked, documents that had come into their possession through unspecified channels. At 3:30 in the morning, they hit send simultaneously on emails to a dozen different recipients. The evidence flowed out into the digital world, unstoppable now, beyond recall or containment. Whatever happened next, Meridian Capital's crimes were no longer hidden. The truth was loose, carried on servers and email chains and journalist inboxes, ready to detonate into public consciousness with Monday's workday. Ivy sat back from the laptop with tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with release that looked almost like grief. "It's done," she said. 6 months of running, of hiding, of thinking I'd die without anyone knowing what they did to me. And it's finally done. Daniel moved to sit beside her on the couch, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced, every muscle aching, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "The FBI will investigate. There's too much evidence to ignore, too many victims. Carver and the executives will face charges. Your name will be cleared." "And you?" Ivy asked, turning to look at him with red-rimmed eyes. "What happens to you now? You're part of this whether you want to be or not. When the investigation starts, when they trace how this evidence came to light, your name will come up." Daniel had been carefully not thinking about this, pushing it away every time the implications tried to surface. "We tell the truth, or most of it. You came to me for help. I let you stay here, helped you access your old files, supported you while you pulled evidence together. We don't mention breaking into Carver's office. That never happened. You had access to the files from your time as his assistant. You'd kept copies when you sensed something was wrong. We stay as close to the truth as possible. They'll question that story, look for holes. Let them look. We've got more important things to prove. That Meridian Capital committed fraud. That they destroyed your life to cover it up. That hundreds of people were robbed. Compared to that, exactly how we obtained the evidence is a technicality." Daniel was trying to convince himself as much as Ivy, hoping that righteous ends would somehow justify questionable means. They sat in exhausted silence while the night slowly gave way to early Sunday morning, neither quite ready to sleep despite their depleted state. The laptop screen glowed between them, showing the sent messages that would soon trigger investigations and arrests and the systematic dismantling of Thomas Carver's criminal enterprise. Daniel checked his phone. 5:43 a.m. In a few hours, he'd need to pick up Emma from Diane's house, return to his normal life, Pretend everything was exactly as it had been before Ivy appeared in his bathroom. Except nothing would ever be exactly the same again. He'd crossed lines he couldn't uncross, made choices that would ripple forward through his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. But he'd also done something that mattered. He'd helped someone fight back against injustice, had refused to accept that powerful people should be immune from consequences, had chosen action over the safe paralysis of witnessing cruelty without responding. Whatever came next, investigation or recognition, consequences or vindication, at least he'd made a choice he could live with. "Thank you," Ivy said quietly, and the weight of those two words seemed to contain everything they'd been through together. "For believing me when no one else would, for risking everything to help a stranger, for being the kind of person who still thinks individual choices can matter in a system designed to grind people like us into nothing." Daniel thought about Emma, about the world he wanted her to grow up in, about the lessons he hoped to teach her through example rather than lecture. "I did it as much for my daughter as for you," he admitted. "I want her to see that her father didn't just accept injustice because fighting it was inconvenient, that when he had a choice between being safe and being decent, he tried to be both, but would choose decent if he had to." "You're a good father," Ivy said. "Emma's lucky to have you. I hope she still thinks so when all this plays out." But even as Daniel spoke the words, he knew he'd made the right choice. Not the safe choice, maybe not even the smart choice, but the right one. The choice he could live with when he looked at his daughter's face and tried to explain what kind of man her father was. They finally slept as dawn broke over Portland, collapsing into exhausted unconsciousness on Daniel's worn furniture. Two people who'd committed crimes in pursuit of justice and would soon discover whether the world recognized the difference. Outside, the city woke to an ordinary Sunday, completely unaware that evidence of massive fraud was already working its way through law enforcement systems, that journalists were opening emails that would soon become major investigations, that Monday morning would bring consequences for people who'd thought themselves untouchable. Daniel's last thought before sleep claimed him was of Emma, her laughter, her trust, her belief that her father would always come home. He'd kept that promise tonight. He'd made it back. And when she asked him someday what he'd done to make the world a little less cruel, he'd be able to tell her the truth. That when someone needed help, he'd helped. That when injustice demanded response, he'd responded. That fear and caution hadn't stopped him from trying to do something that mattered, and whatever came next, that would have to be enough. Sunday morning light filtered through Daniel's bedroom window with the pale insistence of Portland winter, dragging him from sleep that had been too brief and too troubled to offer real rest. His entire body ached with the specific exhaustion that came from adrenaline crash and fear sustained too long. And for a disoriented moment, he couldn't remember why his muscles felt like they'd been wrung out and left to dry. Then memory returned in a rush. The office building, the safe, Carver's casual discussion of ongoing crimes, the evidence now scattered across a dozen inboxes waiting to detonate. Daniel checked his phone with hands that still trembled slightly. 8:17 a.m. No missed calls from police, no emergency alerts, no immediate indication that their break-in had been discovered. Just a cheerful text from Diane sent 20 minutes ago asking what time he'd be picking up Emma, and a message from his delivery company reminding him about Monday's early shift start time. The mundane normalcy of those messages felt surreal against the backdrop of federal crimes committed and massive fraud exposed. Daniel had somehow expected the world to look different this morning, to reflect the seismic shift in his own life. But Portland went about its Sunday business exactly as it always did. People sleeping late, making breakfast, reading newspapers that didn't yet know about Meridian Capital's collapse. In the living room, Ivy was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel's laptop open, her face illuminated by screen glow and barely contained anxiety. She looked up as Daniel emerged, and he saw the same exhausted relief in her eyes that he felt in his bones. "Anything?" Daniel asked, moving to peer over her shoulder at the laptop screen. "The emails were delivered, all of them. I've been checking bounce backs and error messages. Nothing. Which means the FBI has the files, the SEC has them, journalists have them. It's out there now, spreading through systems we can't control or recall." Ivy's voice carried wonder and terror in equal measure. "By Monday afternoon, maybe sooner, people will start making phone calls. Agents will start reviewing evidence. Meridian Capital's world is going to implode, and they won't even see it coming until it's too late to run. Daniel poured coffee with automatic movements, his hands finding mugs and the pot by muscle memory, while his mind spun through implications and consequences. How long before they trace the evidence back to us? That depends on how careful they are, how thorough the investigation gets. The cloud storage accounts are anonymous, created using public computers with no connection to either of us. The emails were sent through encrypted servers that don't log IP addresses. But, Ivy paused, her expression tightening. If they analyze the documents themselves, they might notice they're scans rather than original digital files. That could suggest someone physically accessed Carver's office, and the building's security logs will show us signing in last night. Daniel's stomach dropped. Under our real names, using our actual driver's licenses. As cleaning crew responding to an emergency call, Ivy said quickly, a call that was fake, but they won't know that immediately. It'll take time to check with the actual cleaning company, to realize the work order was fabricated, to connect our presence to the evidence leak. Days, maybe weeks. By then, the investigation will be so far advanced that how the evidence was obtained will matter less than what it proves. It was a hope more than a certainty, and they both knew it. But dwelling on the potential consequences would paralyze them, and Daniel had a daughter to collect and a life to maintain while they waited to see if their gamble had paid off or destroyed them. He texted Diane that he'd be there in an hour, then showered quickly and changed into clean clothes, washing away the physical evidence of the night before while the psychological weight remained lodged in his chest like a stone. When he emerged, Ivy had closed the laptop and was sitting with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd survived trauma and didn't quite know what to do with the aftermath. I'll be gone a few hours, Daniel said. You should sleep. Real sleep, not that exhausted collapse we managed this morning. When I get back with Emma, we'll need to figure out next steps. Where you go from here, what story we tell if investigators contact us, how to keep our accounts consistent. Ivy nodded without looking up. Daniel, when this is over, when Meridian Capital falls and the investigation concludes, I want you to know that I'll tell them the truth. That you helped me out of kindness, that you had no idea what I was planning, that you were just a good person who got dragged into something that wasn't your responsibility. I won't let you face consequences for my choices. We made those choices together, Daniel said quietly. Last night in that office, that was both of us. You don't carry that alone. But Emma has a father who taught her that some things are worth fighting for, even when it's scary. That's what she'll remember. Not the legal complications or the risks, but that her dad tried to do the right thing when it mattered. Daniel grabbed his keys and jacket. Get some rest. We'll figure out the rest when I get back. The drive to Diane's house took Daniel through familiar streets that looked exactly as they had yesterday, as they did every Sunday, and the continuity felt both comforting and jarring. How could the world remain unchanged when his entire life had shifted on its axis? How could people walk their dogs and buy groceries and live their ordinary existences while federal evidence worked its way toward explosive revelations? Emma burst through Diane's door before Daniel could even knock, her face lit with the uncomplicated joy of 7-year-old love. Daddy, we watched 3 movies and made cookies, and Miss Diane let me stay up until midnight. Daniel scooped her into a hug, breathing in her strawberry shampoo and the lingering scent of cookie dough, grounding himself in her solid reality. Sounds like you had quite the adventure. Did you save any cookies for me? Maybe, Emma said with exaggerated mystery. You have to be very nice to me to find out. Diane appeared behind Emma, smiling her usual warm smile, completely oblivious to the crimes her neighbor had committed while she provided innocent cover. She was an angel as always. You look exhausted though, Daniel. Everything go okay with your friend? The question was casual, meaningless, just polite conversation. But Daniel felt the weight of all the lies he'd need to tell going forward, all the truths he'd need to carefully shade to protect Emma from consequences she didn't deserve. Yeah, all handled. Thanks again for watching her on short notice. I owe you. You don't owe me anything. That's what neighbors are for. Diane handed Emma her overnight bag. Come back anytime, sweetheart. We'll make it a regular thing. The drive home proceeded with Emma's cheerful narration of her sleepover. The movies they'd watched, the games they'd played, the cookies they'd burned slightly, but eaten anyway because waste was wrong. Daniel made appropriate sounds of interest and approval, while his mind spun through the immediate future, the conversations he'd need to have, the careful balance of honesty and protection he'd need to maintain with his daughter. As they pulled into the driveway, Emma's narrative suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Daddy, is the sad lady still at our house?" Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What makes you think she's still there?" "Because she didn't have anywhere else to go," Emma said, with the simple logic of childhood. "And you wouldn't let someone stay just one night if they needed more help. That's not how you are." The perceptiveness of the observation made Daniel's chest tight with love and fear in equal measure. Emma saw him more clearly than he sometimes saw himself, understood his patterns and principles with the clarity that came from close observation and unconditional trust. He couldn't lie to her, not directly, not about something this important. "Yes," Daniel admitted, "she's still there, and we need to have a grown-up conversation about that." Inside the house, Ivy had retreated to the couch, looking small and uncertain in Daniel's borrowed clothes. She stood as they entered, her expression shifting between hope and terror at seeing Emma, clearly uncertain what story Daniel had told, what role she was supposed to play. "Emma, this is my friend Ivy," Daniel said carefully, keeping his voice calm and normal. "Ivy's going through a difficult time and is staying with us for a little while until things get better. I need you to be kind and welcoming, okay? Can you do that for me?" Emma studied Ivy with the unblinking directness of children who hadn't yet learned to pretend not to notice things. "You're the one from the kitchen, the one who sounded sad." "Yes," Ivy said softly. "I am. I'm sorry if I scared you. I didn't mean to." "You didn't scare me. You just sounded like how I felt when Mommy went away." Emma's matter-of-fact delivery of this devastating parallel made both adults freeze. "Really sad and like you didn't know what to do next." Daniel hadn't talked much about Emma's mother, the woman who'd left when Emma was 2, unable to handle the demands of parenthood and poverty, who'd signed away her parental rights and disappeared into a new life that didn't include the daughter she'd carried for 9 months. Emma remembered almost nothing about her, but she remembered the feeling of loss, the confusion of someone important suddenly being gone. "That's exactly how I felt," Ivy said, and her voice cracked slightly. "Like everything familiar was gone, and I had to figure out how to keep going anyway." Emma nodded with understanding beyond her years. "Daddy helped you, right? That's what he does. He helps people even when he's really tired and should probably be sleeping." "He did help me," Ivy confirmed. "Your dad is a very good person." "I know," Emma said simply. "Can I have a cookie now? I saved 3 for us to share." The moment broke with that request, tension dissolving into the practical needs of a hungry child. Daniel followed Emma to the kitchen while she retrieved the slightly misshapen cookies from her overnight bag, watching his daughter navigate the social complexity of an unexpected house guest with more grace than most adults could muster. The rest of Sunday passed in strange domesticity, Daniel making a late breakfast while Emma chattered about her sleepover and Ivy helped with dishes, the 3 of them occupying space together with the careful politeness of strangers learning each other's rhythms. Daniel kept checking his phone compulsively, expecting news alerts about Meridian Capital, expecting police at his door, expecting consequences to arrive with dramatic immediacy. But nothing happened. Portland continued its Sunday routine. Rain began falling in the early afternoon, and they ate leftover pasta for dinner while Emma taught Ivy a card game she'd learned at school. Watching them together, his daughter's easy acceptance and Ivy's careful gentleness, Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of what they'd accomplished and what it meant. This wasn't just about exposing corporate fraud or seeking justice for Ivy's destroyed life. It was about the kind of world Emma would inherit, about whether cruelty went unchallenged or whether ordinary people could still make choices that mattered. Every moment Daniel spent teaching Emma that helping others was worth the risk was a moment spent building the foundation of who she'd become. Monday morning arrived with agonizing normalcy. Daniel went to work. Couldn't afford not to. Couldn't risk drawing attention by suddenly calling in sick after a weekend of suspicious activity. He loaded trucks and drove routes with his phone in his pocket, buzzing occasionally with news alerts he was too terrified to check until his lunch break. When he finally looked, his hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. The headline blazed across his screen: "Major investment firm under federal investigation for massive fraud." The article was brief, clearly written hastily as news broke, but the essentials were there. The FBI had raided Meridian Capital's offices early Monday morning, seizing computers and files, escorting executives from the building. Arrest warrants had been issued for Thomas Carver and 3 other top officials. The Securities and Exchange Commission was launching a parallel investigation. Client accounts had been frozen pending review. Daniel read the article 3 times, his heart hammering, searching for any mention of how the evidence had been obtained, any suggestion that investigators suspected a break-in. But there was nothing, just vague references to whistleblower documents and leaked internal files that had prompted the investigation. The journalists were clearly scrambling to understand a story that had exploded without warning, covering the surface facts while the deeper details remained murky. His phone buzzed with a text from Ivy. "Are you seeing this? It's happening. It's actually happening." Daniel called her instead of texting back, needing to hear her voice, to confirm this was real and not some exhaustion-induced hallucination. She answered on the first ring, and he could hear tears in her voice beneath the words. "Thomas was arrested an hour ago. I saw the video. News cameras caught him being led out of the building in handcuffs." The look on his face, Daniel, pure shock. He never thought this could happen to him, never imagined there would be consequences. "What about you?" Daniel kept his voice low, aware of coworkers nearby. "Have investigators contacted you?" "Not yet, but they will. They'll want to interview the person who leaked the evidence, and eventually they'll trace it back to me. I'm ready for that. I'll tell them I had the documents from my time as Carver's assistant, that I'd kept copies when I sensed something was wrong. They might not believe it entirely, but they won't be able to prove otherwise, and by then the evidence will have done its job." Daniel wanted to feel relief, wanted to celebrate the vindication they'd fought for. But all he felt was a bone-deep exhaustion and the lingering fear that consequences were still coming, just slower than he'd expected. "We did it," he said, and the words felt hollow despite their truth. "We did," Ivy confirmed. "We actually did it." The week that followed felt like living in 2 realities simultaneously. Daniel's normal life of work, shifts and parent-teacher conferences and grocery shopping, overlaid with the extraordinary explosion of Meridian Capital's collapse playing out across every news channel and newspaper. More arrests came daily as investigators unraveled the full scope of the fraud. Client victims came forward by the hundreds, sharing stories of retirement funds stolen and college savings evaporated and trust destroyed by people who'd smiled while robbing them blind. Thomas Carver's face became nationally recognizable as the primary architect of the scheme. News cameras caught him at court appearances, his expensive suits and practiced confidence gradually giving way to the hollow-eyed panic of someone watching their entire world burn. The dollar amounts grew more staggering as investigators dug deeper. Not 300 million stolen, but closer to 500 million, siphoned over nearly a decade, while regulators somehow missed every red flag. On Wednesday, 2 FBI agents appeared at Daniel's door in the early evening, showing badges and asking politely if they could speak with him in Ivy Lane about the Meridian Capital investigation. Daniel's heart hammered as he let them inside, acutely aware of Emma doing homework in her room, of how quickly this conversation could go wrong if they asked the right questions. The agents were professional and courteous. A woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Special Agent Morrison, and a younger man named Agent Chen who took notes while his partner asked questions. They sat in Daniel's living room with the careful formality of people who'd done this hundreds of times before, and Daniel tried to project calm cooperation while terror churned in his gut. "Ms. Lane, we understand you were employed as an executive assistant at Meridian Capital until approximately 6 months ago," Morrison began, her voice neutral and factual. "Can you tell us about the circumstances of your termination?" Ivy had clearly prepared for this, her account careful and consistent. She described noticing accounting irregularities, confronting Thomas Carver, being abruptly fired and systematically destroyed. She talked about losing her apartment and bank accounts and phone service, about the men who'd threatened her, about 6 months spent homeless and terrified while she tried to figure out how to expose what she'd discovered. And the documents you provided to our office, the client contracts, the internal audits, the executive communications, where did you obtain those? Morrison's eyes were sharp despite the casual tone of her question. I made copies while I worked there, Ivy said without hesitation. When I started noticing problems, I documented everything I could access, took photos with my phone of documents in Carver's office, copied files from the shared server, saved emails that seemed suspicious. I knew if I confronted them about what I'd found, they'd try to destroy the evidence, so I backed everything up before I said anything. And you kept these copies throughout 6 months of homelessness? Chen spoke for the first time, skepticism clear in his voice. I uploaded them to cloud storage. That was one of the first things I did after being fired. Found a public library computer and made sure the evidence was somewhere they couldn't delete it. Ivy met his eyes steadily. I knew they'd taken everything else from me. I wasn't going to let them take the truth. Morrison made a note on her pad. And Mr. Brooks? How do you fit into this situation? Daniel forced himself to breathe normally, to maintain the careful story they'd agreed upon. I met Ivy about a month ago. She was homeless, looked like she needed help, so I bought her some food. A few weeks later, she showed up at my house asking if she could stay for a night, said she was in danger, that people were following her. I probably should have called the police, but he glanced at Ivy. She seemed genuinely terrified, and I have a daughter. I understand what it means to be desperate and have nowhere to turn. So you let a stranger stay in your home with your child? Chen's tone suggested this was either incredibly stupid or incredibly suspicious. I know how it sounds, Daniel said, but I've been where she was. Not homeless, but poor enough that one bad break could put me there. Close enough that I remember what it feels like to need help and have everyone look through you like you don't exist. So yeah, I let her stay. She told me her story, showed me some of the evidence she had access to, and I encouraged her to go to the authorities, helped her organize the files, supported her while she pulled everything together. That's it. Morrison studied him for a long moment, and Daniel couldn't tell if she believed him or was simply calculating how much it mattered. You understand that breaking and entering to obtain evidence, even evidence of criminal activity, is itself a crime. If we determine that either of you accessed Meridian Capital's offices illegally, we didn't, Ivy interrupted firmly. I had legitimate access to those documents during my employment. I made copies using methods available to me as an executive assistant with authorized access to confidential files. Nothing illegal about an employee documenting potential crimes they witness in the course of their job. That's not quite accurate legally, but we'll let the attorneys sort that out. Morrison closed her notebook and stood, signaling the interview's end. We'll likely have follow-up questions as the investigation continues. Don't leave town without notifying our office. And Ms. Lane, she paused at the door. Whatever you did, however you did it, you probably saved hundreds of people from losing everything. The Bureau takes that into account when evaluating source methods. After the agents left, Daniel and Ivy sat in stunned silence, processing the implied message in Morrison's final words. They knew, or strongly suspected, but they didn't care enough to pursue it because the evidence had done exactly what it was supposed to do: expose criminals and protect victims. The technical legality of how it was obtained mattered less than what it proved. We're going to be okay, Ivy said, and for the first time since she'd appeared in Daniel's bathroom, her voice carried something other than desperation or fear. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of belief that survival was possible. The investigation accelerated over the following weeks, a cascade of arrests and indictments and asset seizures that dominated news cycles. Thomas Carver and his co-conspirators faced hundreds of charges: wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The evidence Ivy had provided formed the backbone of the federal case, supplemented by additional documents seized during raids and testimony from other Meridian Capital employees who'd witnessed aspects of the fraud but been too afraid to report it. Ivy was interviewed multiple times by investigators, journalists, and eventually congressional committees examining regulatory failures that had allowed the fraud to continue for years. She became, somewhat unwillingly, the face of whistleblower courage, the woman who'd lost everything to expose the truth and survived 6 months of hell rather than stay silent. News articles recounted her story with the kind of dramatic flourishes that made Daniel uncomfortable. turning complex reality into simplified narrative about good versus evil. But the attention brought tangible benefits. A victims' rights organization provided Ivy with legal representation at no cost, helping her navigate the complex process of seeking compensation for what Meridian Capital had done to her. The company that had evicted her based on fraudulent documents issued a public apology and settlement payment. Her former bank unfroze accounts and restored access to funds she'd thought lost forever. By March, 2 months after the initial raids, Ivy had moved into a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe, and hers. She'd found work with a nonprofit that helped other whistleblowers navigate legal and financial challenges, using her experience to guide people through systems that seemed designed to punish rather than protect those who reported crimes. Daniel watched her transformation with something like awe, the desperate woman from his bathroom becoming someone who carried her trauma like hard-won wisdom rather than unbearable weight. They remained close in the way of people who'd faced crisis together and survived, checking in regularly, sharing meals occasionally, maintaining the connection forged in those terrifying days when they'd gambled everything on the possibility that justice might prevail. Emma, for her part, accepted Ivy's presence in their lives with the easy adaptability of childhood. She knew only that her father had helped someone in trouble and that Ivy was grateful, a simplified version of events that contained all the essential truth without the complications Emma was too young to process. The trial began in June, nearly 6 months after the evidence had been leaked, and Daniel followed it obsessively despite trying to maintain distance. Thomas Carver's defense attempted to discredit the evidence, to suggest it had been tampered with or obtained illegally, but the sheer volume of corroborating documentation made those arguments hollow. Internal Meridian Capital witnesses confirmed the fraud's mechanisms. Forensic accountants traced the money through elaborate shell companies back to executive accounts. The prosecution built a case so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable. Daniel wasn't there when the verdict was read, couldn't afford to take time off work to attend the trial, but he was loading a truck when his phone buzzed with the news alert. Guilty on all counts. Thomas Carver and his co-conspirators facing decades in federal prison. Victim compensation fund being established from seized assets. Justice, the headlines proclaimed, had been served. He sat in his delivery truck and let himself cry for the first time since this entire ordeal began, not from sadness or relief exactly, but from the overwhelming release of tension he'd been carrying for months. They'd done it. He and Ivy had taken an insane risk, and somehow emerged on the other side with their freedom intact and the guilty actually facing consequences. In a world that so often protected the powerful while grinding the vulnerable into dust, they'd managed to tip the scales just slightly toward fairness. That evening, Daniel took Emma to Ivy's apartment for a celebration dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad and cookies from the same bakery where Diane had taken Emma months ago. The three of them sat around Ivy's small table, and for the first time in Daniel's memory, the conversation felt light rather than weighted with crisis and fear. "What will you do now?" Emma asked Ivy with the directness of children who hadn't learned that some questions were supposed to stay unspoken. "Now that the bad people are in jail." Ivy considered the question seriously, respecting Emma enough to provide an honest answer. "I'm going to keep helping other people who see bad things happening and don't know how to report them safely. And I'm going to try to build a new life that's not defined by what was taken from me. Maybe that makes me naive, but I'm choosing to believe that second chances are possible." "Daddy gave you a second chance," Emma observed, "when he let you stay at our house even though it was probably scary for him." "He did," Ivy agreed, meeting Daniel's eyes across the table. "Your father is one of the bravest people I've ever met, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he helped anyway." Later, after Emma had fallen asleep on Ivy's couch during a movie, Daniel and Ivy stood together on her apartment's small balcony, looking out over the city lights that seemed to stretch forever into the Portland night. "I never thanked you properly," Ivy said quietly, "for believing me, for risking everything to help me, for being the person who proved that kindness still exists even when everything feels designed to crush it." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel said. "You would have done the same thing. You did do the same thing. You survived 6 months of hell rather than give up on justice. That takes more courage than anything I contributed." "We both did impossible things," Ivy countered. You chose compassion when caution would have been safer. I chose to fight when surrender would have been easier. Maybe that's what it takes. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices when the situation demands it. Daniel thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully inside, growing up in a world that was perhaps slightly less cruel because two desperate people had refused to accept that powerful criminals should face no consequences. He thought about all the Meridian Capital victims who'd received some measure of restitution, all the future potential victims who'd been protected by exposing the fraud. I want Emma to know this story someday, Daniel said, when she's old enough to understand the complexity of it. I want her to know that her father wasn't perfect, that he broke laws and took risks that could have destroyed both our lives. But I want her to also know that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're terrified. That individual choices can matter, that the world doesn't have to be accepted as it is. She already knows, Ivy said. Maybe not the details, but she knows who you are. And that's going to shape who she becomes more than any story you could tell her later. They stood in comfortable silence while the city breathed around them, millions of people living their own private struggles and victories, each of them making daily choices about what kind of person to be and what kind of world to create through accumulated small actions. Daniel didn't know what the future held, whether he'd face delayed consequences for their break-in, whether the investigation would eventually turn skeptical eyes toward how the evidence was really obtained, whether the careful story he and Ivy had constructed would hold up under sustained scrutiny. But he knew he'd made the right choice. Not the safe choice, not the prudent choice, but the right one. The choice he could live with when he looked at his daughter's face. The choice that honored everything he wanted her to learn about courage and compassion and refusing to be a passive witness to cruelty. 3 months later, Daniel received a letter from the Federal Victim Compensation Fund. As the person who'd provided housing and support to the whistleblower during a critical period, he was being recognized with a small monetary award, $5,000, paid from seized Meridian Capital assets. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to fix his car's transmission and buy Emma some new clothes and put a modest amount into savings against future emergencies. The letter included a personal note from one of the FBI agents involved in the investigation, thanking him for his role in bringing dangerous criminals to justice. The note carefully avoided any mention of specific methods or timeline, maintaining the plausible deniability that had protected them both. But reading between the lines, Daniel understood the message. They knew, they suspected, and they'd chosen to look the other way because sometimes justice required people to bend rules that powerful criminals had already shattered. On a rainy Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after Ivy had first appeared in his bathroom, Daniel took Emma to visit Ivy's nonprofit office downtown. Ivy had been promoted to program director, overseeing a team of advocates who helped whistleblowers navigate the impossible complexity of reporting fraud while protecting their own safety and livelihoods. The office was small but bright, walls covered with thank you notes from people they'd helped, and Ivy showed Emma around with obvious pride. "This is what your dad made possible," Ivy told Emma, gesturing at the office and the staff working at their desks. "When he chose to help me instead of looking away, he started something that's helped dozens of other people who had nowhere else to turn. That's the power of one person choosing to care." Emma studied the office with her usual serious attention, processing information in ways that suggested understanding beyond her 8 years. "Did you always want to do this job?" she asked Ivy. "No," Ivy admitted. "I wanted to be an executive assistant in a fancy office, making good money and feeling important. But sometimes life takes you places you didn't expect, and you realize the job you thought you wanted wasn't actually the one that would make you feel like your life mattered." She looked at Daniel. "Your dad taught me that. When he helped me, even though it was dangerous and difficult, he showed me what really matters, not success or status or safety, but choosing to be the kind of person who makes the world a little less cruel." On the drive home, Emma was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the rain-soaked streets with the contemplative expression she wore when processing big ideas. Finally, she spoke without looking away from the window. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said simply, "for helping Ivy, for being brave even when you were scared, for showing me what it means to be a good person." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion, with the overwhelming love and gratitude that came from knowing his daughter saw him clearly and still chose pride over judgment. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart, for being kind to Ivy when she needed kindness, for understanding things most kids your age wouldn't understand, for being exactly who you are." "Will you always help people who need help?" Emma asked, "even when it's hard?" Daniel thought about that question, about the commitment it implied, and the promises it asked him to make. "I'll try," he said honestly. "I can't promise I'll always be brave enough or that I'll always know the right thing to do, but I promise I'll try. And I promise that when I make decisions, I'll think about the kind of father I want to be for you, the kind of example I want to set. That's the best I can offer." "That's enough," Emma said, and turned back to watching the rain. Years would pass before Daniel told Emma the full story. The break-in, the safe, the terror of those hours in Carver's office while powerful men casually discussed ongoing crimes. But in that moment, driving through Portland rain with his daughter beside him, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Not the peace of safety or security or knowing the future would be stable, but the deeper peace of living in alignment with his values, of making choices he could defend, of building a life that honored the people he loved and the principles he wanted to pass on. Ivy had been right that night on her balcony. They'd both done impossible things, made choices that felt crazy in the moment, but that time had proven necessary and right. And in doing so, they'd proven something Daniel had almost stopped believing, that ordinary people could still matter, that individual actions could ripple outward in ways that changed lives, that refusing to accept injustice was worth the risk even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against success. The story of how a desperate woman appeared in a bathroom and how an exhausted single father chose compassion over caution became, over time, just one of many stories that shaped who Daniel and Emma were. But it remained the story Daniel returned to whenever he doubted whether his choices mattered, whenever the grinding poverty and exhaustion of his life felt overwhelming, whenever he wondered if trying to be good was worth the effort in a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty. Because he'd lived through proof that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, choosing kindness over fear could change everything. That justice, however delayed and imperfect, was still possible. That the powerful could be held accountable if enough ordinary people refused to look away. And that a single moment of compassion offered to a stranger in desperate need could save not just one life but ripple outward to protect hundreds of others, could transform fear into purpose, survival into advocacy, despair into hope. Years later, when Meridian Capital was just a cautionary tale in business school ethics classes, and Thomas Carver was a forgotten name serving time in a federal facility, Daniel would sometimes think about that rain-soaked night when everything changed, about the choice he'd made to help rather than hide, to risk rather than retreat, to believe that individual actions could matter even when systems seemed designed to render individuals powerless. And every time, he'd know he'd made the right choice. Not because everything turned out perfectly, life was still hard, money still tight, the world still full of casual cruelties he couldn't prevent, but because he'd taught Emma through action rather than words that being brave meant helping anyway. That doing right mattered more than being safe. That the measure of a person wasn't their bank account or job title, but how they treated others when no one was watching and consequences seemed inevitable. That was the legacy he wanted to leave his daughter. Not money or status or comfort, but the unshakable conviction that individual choices mattered, that compassion was never wasted, that refusing to accept injustice was always worth the fight. And on cold Portland nights when the rain hammered against the windows and the world felt too big and cruel to change, Daniel would remember Ivy's face in his bathroom, terrified and desperate, and choosing to keep fighting anyway. Would remember his own decision to help despite every rational reason to turn away. Would remember that together, they'd proven that sometimes courage looked like two ordinary people refusing to accept that powerful criminals should face no consequences. And that would be enough.